I stood in the middle of a brightly lit living room holding a slice of birthday cake while my own sister announced to 50 guests that her 1-year-old son was actually my late wife's biological child. She shoved a forged will into my chest demanding half of my $1 million estate to raise the boy. I looked at the paper, nodded calmly, and fought back a brutal laugh. My sister had no idea my wife was completely incapable of producing a child. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Exactly 1 week after lowering my beautiful wife Diana into the cold ground, I found myself suffocating inside a crowded balloon-filled living room. It was the first birthday party for my sister Monica's son Leo. I attended solely out of a lingering sense of familial duty, a hollow attempt to maintain some connection to the living, while my own heart remained buried in the cemetery. The lively chatter of the guests and the upbeat party music masked the predatory tension building in the corners of the room. I held a paper plate with an untouched slice of cake, eager to slip out the back door and go home to my quiet misery when the music abruptly cut off. Monica tapped a silver spoon against her champagne glass, demanding absolute silence from the 50 people gathered. The sudden quiet was deafening. She climbed onto a dining chair, positioning herself above the crowd, and pointed directly at me. With a rehearsed, trembling voice, she declared to every friend and neighbor present that her son Leo was not biologically hers. She loudly proclaimed that she had served as a secret surrogate using Diana's frozen embryos. The collective gasp from the room felt like a physical blow to my chest. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of the lie, Monica marched across the room and shoved a heavy, legally stamped document hard against my coat. She announced it was Diana's true and final will. According to her screaming declaration, the document legally granted her half of my $1 million home and a massive portion of my estate to raise the rightful biological heir. I did not drop my plate. I took the thick parchment from her aggressive hands. Standing directly behind my sister was my 35-year-old biological son, Devin, and his wife, Megan. They were not shocked. They were not confused. They stood with their arms crossed, aggressively nodding in agreement with Monica's insane proclamation. The ambush had been meticulously coordinated. I locked eyes with Devin, silently searching his face for any remaining shred of the honorable man I had raised. He immediately looked down at his expensive leather shoes, entirely unable to meet his father's gaze. He was a coward, completely manipulated by the woman standing next to him. Megan, my white daughter-in-law, did not look away. She stared right back at me with a smug, triumphant smirk painted across her face. She looked at me exactly the way she had looked at me for the past 5 years, with unfiltered, arrogant disdain. Megan had always viewed me as an uneducated relic. As a retired civil engineer, I valued hard work over flashy displays. She constantly mocked my faded, dented 2005 pickup truck and complained about the modest, middle-class clothes I wore. She firmly believed that my $1 million house was a lucky fluke, an inherited anomaly that I did not deserve. She was completely unaware of the reality. Diana and I had deliberately lived far below our means for 4 decades. We drove old vehicles and wore simple clothes to deflect the endless, exhausting greed of relatives exactly like Monica. Megan had absolutely no idea that my faded jeans and scuffed boots were a conscious disguise shielding a massive, highly lucrative commercial real estate empire. Diana and I owned half the retail plazas in the city. Megan thought she was executing a brilliant, ruthless coup to steal a retirement fund and a nice house. She thought she was outsmarting a frail, grieving old man. She was merely playing checkers against a man who owned the entire board. The guests murmured in shocked whispers, waiting for me to explode. They expected shouting denial, perhaps a physical altercation. They wanted the spectacle of a broken, grieving widower losing his mind in front of his community. I refused to give them a single ounce of satisfaction. I did not scream. I did not throw the fraudulent document in Monica's face. I simply smoothed the wrinkled edges of the heavy paper, folded it with slow, deliberate precision, and slipped it securely into the inner pocket of my coat. I looked Monica dead in the eye and spoke with a calm, freezing authority that cut through the murmurs in the room. I told her I understood her claim perfectly. I promised her I would review the document with the utmost legal scrutiny. I had to bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper just to suppress a dark, punishing laugh. Monica and Megan had built their entire criminal conspiracy on a foundational medical impossibility. They had fabricated a tear-jerking narrative about frozen embryos and secret surrogacy, completely blind to the fact that Diana had undergone a radical, life-saving total hysterectomy at the age of 22. She had survived aggressive cancer, but the surgery left her entirely and permanently incapable of producing a single egg. There were no frozen embryos. There was no biological heir. The document burning a hole in my pocket was not just a fake will. It was undeniable proof of massive, coordinated federal fraud, but I chose to stay silent. I knew that correcting their lie in a crowded living room would only cause them to panic and destroy the evidence. I needed them to confidently submit that forged document into a sworn court record. I needed them to commit absolute, inescapable perjury. I set my paper plate on the nearest table, tipped my hat politely to the horrified guests, and walked out the front door with my dignity entirely intact. The cool evening air hit my face as I walked down the driveway. I did not look back at the house, though I could feel Megan's greedy eyes burning into my spine from the front window. I climbed into the driver's seat of my faded pickup truck and closed the door, sealing out the noise of the neighborhood. The exact second I turned the key in the ignition, the dashboard lit up and my phone vibrated violently in my pocket with a piercing, continuous alarm. I pulled it out and stared at the glowing screen. It was a high-priority level red fraud alert from my private offshore banking institution. An unauthorized emergency withdrawal attempt of exactly $150,000 was currently pending on my main checking account. The predators were not just waiting for the forged will to clear the courts. They were already inside my vault. I gripped the steering wheel of my truck tight enough to turn my knuckles gray. I navigated the busy downtown streets with an aggressive but perfectly controlled precision. I parked right in front of the main doors of my private bank and walked inside with heavy steps. The thick glass doors slid open to reveal a scene of absolute chaos in the marble lobby. Megan was standing at the main teller desk, slamming her designer handbag against the polished wood counter. She was shouting at the terrified staff, threatening to sue the entire financial institution for withholding funds that she claimed rightfully belonged to her fake biological child. I walked past her, screaming fit, without turning my head, and went straight to the branch manager's private office. Mr. Vance was pacing nervously behind his mahogany desk, sweating profusely and wiping his forehead with a wrinkled handkerchief. He locked the door the second I stepped inside and pulled the blinds down to block the lobby view. He nervously informed me that my son Devin and his wife Megan had just presented an emergency power of attorney order to the front desk. They had submitted a legal petition claiming that my wife's recent death had triggered a severe, incapacitating episode of grief-induced dementia. They told the bank I was highly unstable and no longer mentally fit to manage my own finances. Because they presented officially stamped court filings, bank protocol strictly required Mr. Vance to place a temporary administrative freeze on my primary checking account. Megan was currently in the lobby demanding the bank immediately release a cashier's check for $150,000 to secure the baby's future before I could supposedly waste it all. She was aggressively waving her phone, threatening to call the local news stations and drag the bank into a massive public relations nightmare. Mr. Vance apologized profusely, explaining that his hands were completely tied by the legal department until the guardianship hearing could be officially resolved in court. He thought I was trapped. He thought I was just an ordinary grieving retiree caught in a tragic family dispute over a modest pension. I stood perfectly still and looked through the narrow gap in the office blinds. I watched my biological son, Devin, standing in the lobby a few feet behind his wife. He was looking down at his phone, cowardly, letting Megan do all the shouting and threatening. A sharp, heavy pain twisted deep in my chest as I looked at him. I clearly remembered teaching that boy how to tie his first necktie for his high school graduation. I remembered working exhausting double shifts at the engineering firm just to make sure he graduated from a good college without a single dollar of student debt. Devin used to be an honorable, hardworking young man who respected his roots and valued our family name. Then he met Megan. She systematically alienated him from our family, mocking our simple traditions and introducing him to a rapid, unsustainable world of luxury that he could never actually afford on his own. She convinced him that social status was everything and that family loyalty was a pathetic weakness. The betrayal cut me deeper than any physical wound I had ever suffered, but I possessed an absolute ability to compartmentalize my pain. I turned away from the window and looked at the sweating branch manager. I told Mr. Vance to step away from his computer terminal immediately. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a heavy, solid metal black card. It was my top-tier private wealth management credential, a rare level of banking clearance that bypassed the local retail branch entirely. I inserted the security token into the terminal and logged directly into the central corporate server. The temporary freeze on my account was a standard retail protocol, but my commercial real estate assets were heavily shielded by an elite corporate tier. I legally executed an instant, irrevocable wire transfer. In a matter of seconds, I routed my entire liquid fortune out of my personal checking account and deposited it directly into a highly secure, untraceable, blind corporate trust. The money simply vanished into a digital vault that neither Megan nor the local family courts could ever touch. I did not stop at securing my own wealth. The defensive phase was complete, so I immediately launched a brutal financial offensive. For the past 4 years, I had been quietly keeping Devin and Megan afloat. I was the secret guarantor on the expensive lease for Megan's luxury sport utility vehicle. I paid the exorbitant monthly balance on their premium credit cards, ensuring they could keep up fake appearances at their exclusive country club without facing the humiliation of declined transactions. They foolishly believed their lavish lifestyle was sustained by Devin's mediocre salary and Megan's non-existent career as a lifestyle influencer. They had absolutely no idea that I was the invisible safety net preventing their entire fake world from collapsing into brutal bankruptcy. I opened the credit management portal on the manager's computer and selected every single account linked to their names. I canceled the hidden credit lines effective immediately. I flagged the accounts as permanently closed and authorized a strict zero balance limit. I formally removed myself as the financial guarantor on their vehicle lease, triggering an automatic and immediate default notice to the local dealership. I logged out of the secure system, took my metal card, and thanked Mr. Vance for his time. I unlocked the office door and walked out into the bright lobby. Megan was still yelling at a terrified young bank teller, loudly demanding immediate cash access to my money. I walked right past her. I did not stop, and I did not say a single word. I simply looked her in the eyes, tipped my hat to her in complete silence, and kept walking toward the glass exit. The exact moment I pushed the heavy doors open to leave the building, a loud notification chime echoed through the quiet lobby. Megan stopped yelling and looked down at her phone screen. The automated text message from her credit provider informed her that every single card in her designer wallet had just been completely and permanently declined. I climbed back into my truck and started the engine. A profound sense of clarity washed over me as I merged onto the highway and drove away from the bank. The emotional fog of my recent grief had completely lifted, replaced by an iron determination to protect my wife's legacy from the parasites trying to consume it. I drove through the winding suburban roads until I reached the tall iron gates of my private property. I punched in my security code and the heavy gates slowly swung open to admit my vehicle. As I drove up the long paved driveway toward the main house, a harsh, repetitive alarm sounded from inside the cabin of my truck. My phone buzzed violently in the cup holder with a priority notification from my newly upgraded home security system. I picked up the device and stared at the bright red text flashing across the screen. It was an active perimeter alert. The terrifying message read, "Glass break sensor triggered rear patio study door." I parked my truck near the edge of the driveway, keeping the engine noise to an absolute minimum. The notification on my phone had been agonizingly precise. I stepped onto the rear patio and felt the loud crunch of safety glass beneath my heavy boots. The large sliding door was completely shattered, its frame bent inward from a brutal, forceful impact. I stepped through the empty frame and moved down the hallway with silent, deliberate steps. I did not call out a warning. I simply followed the sound of splintering wood and frantic, hushed arguments echoing from the end of the corridor. It was coming directly from Diana's private study. I stood in the doorway and watched the absolute desecration of my late wife's sanctuary. Beloved books were swept off the mahogany shelves in disorganized piles. Framed photographs of our shared history lay face down on the Persian rug. My biological son Devin was gripping a heavy brass paperweight, using it to brutally smash the locks on Diana's vintage filing cabinet. He was sweating profusely, breathing heavily, and tossing manila folders onto the floor like garbage. Megan stood over him like a demanding supervisor, rapidly flipping through the papers, tossing them aside angrily when they did not contain what she wanted. She was desperately looking for the physical deed to the house. I cleared my throat. Devin froze instantly, dropping the brass paperweight with a loud thud that shook the floorboards. He backed away from the desk, his eyes wide with the terrified realization of a child caught stealing. Megan did not freeze or show an ounce of shame. She spun around her face, twisting into a mask of pure, entitled rage. She marched right up to me, pointing a manicured finger inches from my face. She screamed that I had no legal right to freeze the bank accounts. She demanded I hand over the security codes to the floor safe immediately. Her voice echoed off the walls, shrill and demanding, claiming that the house and everything in it legally belonged to her now to secure the future of the baby. She yelled that I was a bitter, confused old man trying to steal from my own flesh and blood. I looked past her screaming face and focused my attention on the hallway behind me, tracing the path of the shattered glass. I had installed that reinforced patio door with my own hands exactly 30 years ago. I spent an entire weekend meticulously measuring, cutting, and securing the heavy steel frame because I wanted to ensure my family was protected from the unpredictable dangers of the outside world. I wanted Diana and Devin to sleep soundly, knowing our home was an impenetrable fortress. I never once considered that the true threat to my family would eventually come from inside the house wearing my son's wedding ring. I shifted my gaze back to Devin. He was practically vibrating with panic, refusing to look me in the eye as he nervously shifted his weight from foot to foot. It was entirely obvious to anyone watching who was running this criminal operation. Devin was not a calculating mastermind. He was just a terrified, manipulated pawn caught in a web of his own weakness and his desperate need to please a woman who despised his origins. Megan was the undisputed puppeteer. She was the one issuing the orders, orchestrating the fake will, and directing the physical destruction of my property. I felt a sudden surge of profound sorrow for my son, mourning the honorable man he could have been, but I buried that feeling instantly. Sorrow was a luxury I could not afford right now. Letting my emotions dictate my actions would only give Megan the exact leverage she needed to exploit my grief. I had to remain perfectly stoic. I had to treat them not as family members who had lost their way, but as hostile intruders actively trespassing on a secured job site. I did not raise my voice to match her screaming. I simply reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened my central security application, bypassed the main menu, and pressed my thumb firmly against the red silent panic button. The system instantly established a direct, uncancelable connection to the local police precinct, signaling a priority 1 home invasion. I slid the phone back into my pocket and looked at my watch. I calmly informed Megan that she was currently standing in a private residence without authorization, surrounded by the physical evidence of a violent break-in. I told them that the silent alarm had just been triggered and an emergency dispatch was already rapidly approaching our location. I explained with absolute freezing clarity that when the police arrived, they would not find a simple family dispute over inheritance. They would find 2 hostile intruders actively committing felony breaking and entering, extensive property damage, and attempted burglary against an elderly homeowner. Devin turned completely pale, the color draining from his face as the gravity of his actions hit him. He grabbed Megan's arm, begging her to leave, telling her frantically that the police in this particular neighborhood did not ask polite questions when responding to a home invasion. Megan tried to yank her arm away, opening her mouth to scream another entitled demand, but the sheer icy reality of my unblinking stare finally broke through her arrogant delusion. I told them they had exactly 3 minutes to get off my property before heavily armed officers pulled into the driveway with their sirens blaring and guns drawn. I took a deliberate step to the side, leaving the path to the hallway completely open. The fight entirely drained out of Devin. He bolted past me, dragging a furious, cursing Megan behind him. They stumbled over the scattered debris in the hallway, their shoes crunching loudly over the broken glass as they sprinted toward the backyard. I stood perfectly still in the ruined study and listened to their car engine roar to life in the distance. The tires squealed violently against the asphalt as they sped away into the night, leaving behind a trail of dropped files and a completely shattered illusion of family. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated my driveway less than 4 minutes later. I spent the remainder of the night calmly filing a formal police report and securing the breached patio door with heavy plywood. I did not sleep a single wink. At exactly 7 o'clock the next morning, a sharp, aggressive knock echoed through the quiet house. I opened the front door to find a process server in a cheap suit holding a thick manila envelope. He asked to confirm my name, shoved the envelope hard against my chest, and walked away without another word. I tore open the seal and pulled out a stack of heavily stamped legal documents. It was an aggressive, expedited court subpoena. Megan and Monica had officially joined forces to file an emergency guardianship petition. They were demanding an immediate hearing to have me forcibly committed to a locked psychiatric ward. I sat perfectly still in the center of a sleek, glass-walled conference room in downtown Atlanta, watching my attorney meticulously read through the aggressive court summons I had been served that very morning. Mr. Hayes was a sharp, impeccably dressed man who had built a ruthless, terrifying reputation for entirely dismantling hostile corporate takeovers. He placed the heavy stack of legal documents on the polished mahogany table, adjusted his glasses, and sighed. He informed me that my daughter-in-law Megan and my sister Monica had not just hired a standard family lawyer. They had retained one of the most notoriously aggressive litigation firms in the state, a legal group famous for bankrupting and suffocating their opponents into complete submission before a trial even began. Hayes slid a specific psychiatric evaluation across the table for me to read. Megan had somehow procured a heavily falsified psychological profile signed by an out-of-network doctor who had never actually met me or spoken a single word to me in my entire life. The fabricated document explicitly stated that my recent grief over my wife's passing had triggered severe rapid-onset dementia paired with highly unpredictable, violently aggressive outbursts. The petition claimed that I was an immediate physical danger to the general public and severely incapable of making rational financial decisions regarding my own properties. They were asking the judge to grant an emergency order to have me forcibly removed from my home and permanently committed to a locked high-security psychiatric ward. Once I was legally incapacitated and trapped behind steel doors, Megan would assume total control as the temporary executor of my entire estate to manage the funds for her fake heir. She was using the legal system as a blunt weapon to steal my freedom, my dignity, and my fortune in one single, highly coordinated strike. Hayes folded his hands together and leaned forward. He told me the psychiatric claims were completely baseless but extremely dangerous if left unchallenged by our side. Hayes asked me directly if I wanted him to file a massive counter-injunction to shut the entire operation down before it could even reach a judge's desk. I did not answer him right away. I looked down at the gold wedding band on my left hand, running my thumb over the smooth, worn metal. My mind drifted back to the final agonizing month of my beloved wife's life. Diana had been suffering through brutal, exhausting rounds of chemotherapy, her body failing her with every passing day. But her brilliant analytical mind remained razor-sharp. During those terrible nights when she could not sleep through the pain, she did not rest. She sat up in bed with a heavy scanner resting on her lap, painstakingly digitizing every single piece of our financial history, our corporate charters, and her complete, unredacted medical records. She encrypted everything onto secure drives with layered passwords. When I begged her to put the computer away and just rest her tired eyes, she looked at me with an unyielding, fierce determination. She told me she knew exactly how greedy and relentless my sister Monica was, and she saw right through Megan's toxic sense of entitlement. Diana spent her final living days building an impenetrable digital fortress because she knew that the exact second she took her last breath, the vultures would aggressively circle my wealth. She suffered through physical agony to hand me the ultimate legal shield. I realized in that quiet conference room that blocking the hearing now would be a massive strategic failure. It would simply swat the vultures away temporarily, allowing them to regroup, refine their lies, and strike again when I was least prepared to defend my home. I looked up from my wedding ring and met my attorney's questioning gaze. I gave Mr. Hayes a highly calculated, utterly counterintuitive instruction. I told him I absolutely did not want him to dismiss the case or file a single blocking motion. I ordered him to let the emergency guardianship hearing proceed exactly as scheduled. Hayes narrowed his eyes, confused by my sudden willingness to walk directly into a highly orchestrated legal ambush, warning me that entering that courtroom without a preemptive strike was a massive risk to my personal freedom. I explained my logic with freezing, absolute clarity. If we simply blocked the initial petition, Megan and Monica would walk away clean. They would face absolutely no legal consequences for their fraudulent, harassing actions, and they would spend the next 10 years draining my resources with endless civil suits. I needed them to feel completely confident, arrogant, and untouchable. I wanted them to walk into a federal courtroom, raise their right hands, and swear under the penalty of extreme perjury that their fabricated story was the absolute truth. I needed Megan to legally submit the forged will into the official binding court record. I needed her to submit the fake psychiatric evaluation and the fabricated biological surrogacy claims directly to a federal judge. Once those documents were officially entered into the legal record under oath, the trap would permanently lock around their ankles. Their greedy little family dispute would instantly escalate into massive, undeniable federal fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. They were willingly offering me the exact rope needed to hang them, and I was going to quietly step back and let them tie the knot themselves. Hayes sat back in his heavy leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face as he finally understood the sheer brutality of my strategy. He agreed to let them proceed, noting that he would prepare our defensive counterstrikes in absolute secrecy. We would let them build their entire case on a foundation of gasoline, and when the moment was perfectly right, I would strike the match. I stood up, shook his hand, and walked out of the law firm, feeling completely in control of the impending war they had foolishly started. The exact moment I stepped onto the busy downtown sidewalk and walked toward my truck, my phone began vibrating frantically in my pocket. It was not a single notification. It was a rapid, endless stream of incoming text messages, alerts, and missed calls from people in my neighborhood, former engineering colleagues, and even members of my local church congregation. I unlocked my screen and found an inbox completely flooded with angry, disgusted messages demanding to know what kind of heartless monster I had suddenly become. A furious neighbor had aggressively forwarded me a link to a social media video. I clicked the link and watched my sister Monica crying hysterically on screen, clutching her infant son tight to her chest. She had posted a highly edited, professionally produced video accusing me of violently hoarding a deceased woman's wealth, abusing a helpless biological baby, and selfishly stealing my late wife's dying wish for internet sympathy. I drove to the local hardware store to purchase heavy deadbolts and reinforced steel plating to repair the shattered frame of my back patio door. The exact moment I walked through the sliding glass entrance, the usual warm atmosphere of my neighborhood vanished completely. The aisles felt cold and hostile. I could feel the heavy, judgmental stares of people I had known for years burning into my back. Whispers followed me past the plumbing supplies and the lumber racks. When I reached the front register, the young cashier, a kid I had personally sponsored for a community college scholarship just 2 years prior, refused to look me in the eye. He snatched my credit card from the counter, processed the transaction in aggressive silence, and practically threw my receipt back at me. As I picked up my heavy bags of steel hardware and turned toward the exit, a large man stepped directly into my path, physically blocking the automatic doors. It was a retired contractor I had played poker with every other Friday for over 2 decades. His face was twisted with absolute disgust. He pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at my chest and loudly called me a heartless, greedy monster in front of the entire store. He screamed that abandoning a helpless infant and spitting on my deceased wife's final wishes was the most despicable act of betrayal he had ever witnessed. He shoved his smartphone into my face, forcing me to look at the screen. Monica's fabricated tear-jerking video was playing on an endless loop. He aggressively informed me that the video had already crossed 100,000 views in our local county alone. My community, the very people I had quietly supported and built alongside for my entire adult life, had instantly convicted me in the court of public opinion, based entirely on a 5-minute video of my sister crying fake tears. I stood perfectly still under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hardware store, holding 40 pounds of steel deadbolts in my hands. I absorbed the venomous insults and the aggressive public shaming without letting my breathing hitch or my posture break. A younger, more reckless version of myself might have dropped the bags, raised my voice, and engaged in a bitter screaming match right there in the checkout lane. I might have desperately tried to defend my honor to a crowd of strangers who had already made up their minds, but I did not waste a single breath on them. I felt the familiar grounding memory of my late wife Diana wash over my mind. Diana navigated every single hardship in her life with an untouchable, majestic grace. She possessed a core philosophy that she repeated to me whenever we faced prejudice or ignorant hostility in our early business years. She always told me that dignity is a weapon loud people simply cannot comprehend. She firmly believed that reacting with anger only validates a fool's delusion, while absolute silence starves their fire of oxygen. I looked at the angry man blocking my path. I did not justify my actions. I did not explain the forged will, the impending federal fraud case, or the biological impossibilities. I simply stared at him with a cold, yielding silence until the heavy weight of my unbroken eye contact made him shift his weight and look away. He nervously stepped aside. I walked out into the bright sunlight of the parking lot, absolutely refusing to engage in a pathetic shouting match over a shopping cart. I loaded my supplies into my truck, protecting my peace with total discipline. The second I closed the heavy door of my pickup truck, isolating myself from the hostile stares of the parking lot, I pulled out my phone. I navigated directly to the viral video that had just assassinated my local reputation. I watched my sister Monica wipe away non-existent tears while begging the public to help her rescue her baby from my tyrannical greed. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, perfectly engineered to trigger outrage and generate blind sympathy. But something about the sheer velocity of the video's reach bothered my highly analytical mind. Monica was a 52-year-old woman who barely knew how to operate her basic email account, let alone optimize a social media post to reach 100,000 targeted local viewers overnight. A localized viral explosion of that specific magnitude required sophisticated algorithmic momentum. It required dedicated professional engineering. I opened my encrypted messaging application and attached the video link. I sent it directly to a private cyber investigator highly recommended by my attorney, Mr. Hayes. This investigator was a former federal intelligence contractor who specialized in tracing digital footprints and exposing corporate espionage. I did not ask him for a simple background check. I ordered a massive, unrestricted deep trace on the origin of the video's sudden algorithmic boost. I instructed him to tear apart the underlying metadata, track the initial sharing accounts, and follow the digital money trail back to the absolute source. I knew my daughter-in-law Megan was the true architect of this entire operation. She was desperate to destroy my public standing to ensure no one would believe me when I inevitably fought the psychiatric guardianship petition. She wanted to isolate me completely, cutting off my community support network so I would be forced to face her legal ambush entirely alone. I put the truck in gear and drove back to my gated property. I spent the next 2 hours systematically reinforcing my shattered patio door with heavy steel plates and industrial deadbolts, turning my home into a physical fortress while I waited for the digital results. I worked meticulously, driving each steel screw into the solid wood with the focused, quiet intensity of a man preparing for absolute war. Exactly 2 hours later, my secure phone line rang. The cyber investigator delivered a set of data so shocking, it fundamentally shifted my understanding of their absolute desperation. The virality of Monica's video was entirely purchased. The investigator had cracked the routing numbers and discovered that Megan had secretly wired exactly $10,000 to an offshore dark web reputation destruction farm. This illicit company utilized thousands of automated bot accounts to aggressively force the video into the daily feeds of everyone living within a 50-mile radius of my home. But the truly lethal revelation was the actual source of the funding. Megan did not use personal savings or a standard credit card because I had already frozen those lifelines. She had secured the $10,000 through a highly violent, illegal underground payday loan syndicate. She had literally mortgaged her own physical safety to destroy my reputation. I sat in the reinforced silence of my study staring at the digital report from the cyber investigator. Knowing Megan was relying on violent payday loans to fund her online smear campaign triggered a massive red flag. People with legitimate wealth do not borrow money from street-level loan sharks to manipulate social media. I immediately picked up my phone and called my attorney, Mr. Hayes. I authorized him to bypass standard inquiries and deploy a forensic accountant to run a full, unrestricted financial background check on both Devin and Megan. I wanted every hidden ledger, every offshore asset, and every illicit transaction dragged out into the light. Within 48 hours, a thick encrypted dossier arrived directly in my secure inbox. The sheer volume of their financial devastation was absolutely staggering. They were not merely greedy children impatiently waiting for an inheritance. They were actively drowning in catastrophic, life-threatening debt. Megan had maxed out every conceivable line of credit to maintain the illusion of high society wealth, but Devin was the one holding a live grenade. The forensic audit uncovered a terrifying hidden ledger. Devin had become deeply entangled with an illegal underground sports betting syndicate operating out of a neighboring state. He had placed massive, highly leveraged wagers on collegiate and professional games, hopelessly chasing his losses with increasingly desperate bets. The total principal and compounding interest had ballooned to exactly $400,000. The syndicate had officially sold his debt to a violent collection firm. The dossier included intercepted digital communications threatening severe physical consequences if Devin did not produce a six-figure cash payment by the end of the month. The puzzle pieces instantly snapped together with terrifying clarity. This was never a standard family inheritance dispute over property and pensions. This was a frantic, terrifying struggle for sheer physical survival. The polished facade of my son's corporate life was a hollow shell hiding an impending violent implosion. I closed the dossier and leaned back in my heavy leather chair, absorbing the brutal reality of my son's predicament. I suddenly understood the exact mechanics of their grand conspiracy. The fake surrogacy claim, the forged will presented at the birthday party, the aggressive guardianship attempt. None of this was about securing long-term generational wealth. It was a frantic, desperate cash grab designed to generate immediate liquid capital to pay off violent criminals before they broke Devin's legs. I remembered the early days when Diana and I first started building our commercial real estate portfolio. We took massive risks, but we always calculated our exposure. I tried to teach Devin those exact same principles of fiscal responsibility. I bought him ledgers and taught him how to balance his accounts before he even entered high school. But Megan had poisoned his mind, convincing him that aggressive leverage and projecting an image of unlimited wealth were the true markers of success. They had painted themselves into a lethal corner. My sister Monica was nothing more than a useful idiot in their scheme. They had manipulated her lifelong jealousy of Diana, promising her a small slice of my $1-million home if she played the role of the outraged surrogate mother. Monica was arrogant enough to crave the attention and stupid enough to believe Megan would actually share the stolen wealth. Megan never intended to give Monica a single dime. The second the estate was liquidated, every cent would go straight to the betting syndicate to save Devin's life. Monica was stepping directly into a crossfire she could not comprehend. She was merely a convenient human shield for my white daughter-in-law's criminal mismanagement. I felt a cold resolve settle over my mind. They had chosen to play a lethal game, and I was going to change the rules. I refused to let my sister remain comfortably ignorant of the violent forces she had aligned herself with. If Monica wanted to participate in a high-stakes extortion plot against my family, she needed to fully understand the caliber of criminals standing right behind her. I printed a physical copy of the forensic accountant's debt report. I took a thick red marker and deliberately highlighted the massive $400,000 deficit. I drew bold, aggressive circles around the names of the violent underground creditors and the intercepted text messages threatening severe physical harm to Devin and his associates. I wanted the threat to be completely undeniable. I wanted Monica to hold the physical proof of her own impending destruction in her hands. I placed the highlighted documents into a blank, unmarked envelope. I did not include a return address or a personal note. The numbers and the threats spoke louder than any warning I could possibly write. I drove across town to a public post office in a different zip code and dropped the envelope directly into the outgoing mail slot. I paid in cash for expedited overnight delivery to Monica's residential address. I calculated the exact psychological impact this package would unleash. Monica was fundamentally a coward who only picked fights when she believed she held the absolute upper hand. Once she opened that envelope and read the syndicate's violent ultimatums, her arrogant confidence would shatter into pure paranoia. She would immediately realize that she was never a respected partner in Megan's master plan. She would recognize that she was nothing more than disposable bait. When the criminal debt collectors inevitably came looking for Devon's promised inheritance, they would find Monica proudly claiming to be the new heir to my estate. Megan was actively setting my sister up to take the fall for a $400,000 mob debt. By anonymously exposing the truth, I was completely destroying the trust between the conspirators. I was planting a highly toxic seed of suspicion right in the center of their alliance. The forged will and the fake surrogacy required absolute unity to survive legal scrutiny. Once Monica realized her life was in danger, she would panic and turn on Megan to save herself. I drove back to my fortified house, satisfied that the internal sabotage was already in motion. I walked through my heavy front door and locked the reinforced deadbolts. The house was quiet, insulated from the chaos I had just unleashed upon my sister. I walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water when a distinct sharp ping echoed from my pocket. It was an entirely different tone from the standard security alerts. I pulled out my phone and opened a hidden tracking application. A bright red dot was pulsing actively on a digital map. Before Diana passed away, we had securely stored her prized possession in a remote climate-controlled rental garage on the edge of the city. I had secretly hardwired a military-grade GPS tracker deep inside the chassis of her vintage 1968 Mustang. The pulsing red dot on my screen was moving rapidly down the interstate. Someone had breached the storage facility and stolen my late wife's vehicle. I grabbed my keys, bolted out the door, and fired up my heavy pickup truck. The digital map on my dashboard illuminated the Mustang's exact trajectory, updating its coordinates every 3 seconds. I navigated the late afternoon traffic with aggressive, unyielding precision, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tracked the pulsing red dot. It was moving steadily toward the wealthy north side of the city, finally coming to a complete stop at an address I immediately recognized. It was an elite, high-end exotic auto dealership known for discreetly acquiring and flipping rare vintage vehicles for extremely wealthy collectors. I pulled into the sprawling, immaculate parking lot and parked my faded, dented truck right next to a row of imported sports cars. I stepped out and walked purposefully toward the towering glass facade of the showroom. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I immediately spotted the unmistakable, flawless cherry-red paint of Diana's 1968 Mustang resting on the polished white tile of the showroom floor. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors, ignoring the eager sales representatives who immediately tried to intercept me in my work boots and faded jeans. My eyes locked onto the glass-walled manager's office at the far end of the floor. There she was. Megan sat across from the dealership's general manager, aggressively tapping a manicured finger against the mahogany desk. She was frantically waving a piece of paper in his face, visibly frustrated by his professional hesitation. Through the glass, I could read her hostile, impatient body language perfectly. She was trying to force a rushed off-the-books transaction before the bank closed. I knew exactly what that piece of paper was. It was a hastily forged vehicle title. She was violently demanding a $70,000 instant cash buyout, completely desperate to liquidate the stolen asset before the close of business so she could hand the money over to Devon's violent creditors. She was trying to sell my late wife's legacy for a fraction of its true value just to save her own skin. I stopped a few feet away from the manager's office, standing entirely unnoticed in the shadow of a luxury display vehicle. I turned my gaze back to the cherry-red Mustang. A profound, suffocating weight pressed down on my chest as I looked at the pristine chrome bumpers and the immaculate leather interior. That car was not just a piece of machinery, it was a tangible piece of my shared history with Diana. I spent 5 painstaking years restoring that exact engine block with her. We spent countless late nights in our dusty home garage, our hands covered in thick black grease, carefully rebuilding the carburetor and hunting down authentic vintage parts from across the country. Diana had painstakingly hand-stitched the upholstery herself, bleeding onto the leather to get it perfect. When we finally got the engine to turn over and roar to life, she cried tears of absolute joy. It was her ultimate pride and joy, a mechanical masterpiece that represented our patience, our teamwork, and our enduring love. We drove it down the coast for our 30th wedding anniversary, the wind blowing through her hair as she smiled at me from the passenger seat. Now I had to watch my ruthlessly entitled daughter-in-law treat a piece of our very soul like a cheap pawn shop trinket. Megan had absolutely no concept of the love and sweat poured into that chassis. To her, the Mustang was nothing more than a disposable bargaining chip, a quick fix to cover up her husband's pathetic criminal mistakes. She was trying to trade my wife's masterpiece to appease a violent underground betting syndicate, completely erasing the decades of love built into that steel frame. I did not confront her alone. While speeding down the interstate, I had made a highly calculated phone call to a direct contact at the local police precinct, explaining that an active grand theft auto was culminating in an illegal sale at this exact location. I waited patiently in the showroom until the heavy glass doors opened behind me. Two uniformed police officers stepped inside, their hands resting on their utility belts, their expressions stern and professional. I signaled to them, and together we walked directly toward the manager's office. I did not knock. I pushed the heavy office door open, letting it hit the wall with a loud, authoritative thud. Megan whipped her head around, her smug, impatient expression instantly evaporating into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The general manager stood up, utterly confused and alarmed by the sudden intrusion of armed law enforcement into his elite establishment. I walked straight up to his desk, completely ignoring Megan's presence. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the authentic state-issued vehicle title, complete with the official holographic watermarks and Diana's original notarized signature, transferring the car solely into my name. I dropped the heavy, undeniable proof of ownership directly on top of Megan's cheap, heavily fabricated forgery. I looked the manager dead in the eye and formally reported the 1968 Mustang sitting on his showroom floor as a stolen vehicle. I explicitly stated that the woman sitting across from him had broken into a secure private storage facility, committed grand theft auto, and was actively attempting to execute a fraudulent sale using forged state documents. The officers immediately moved in. They instructed Megan to stand up and place her hands behind her back. She erupted into absolute hysterical panic. As the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around her wrists, she began thrashing and screaming at the top of her lungs. She yelled to the bewildered dealership staff that I was a completely insane, abusive old man suffering from severe dementia. She screamed that the car belonged to her baby and that I was illegally stealing her rightful property. I stood perfectly stoic, my posture unbroken, letting her humiliate herself in front of a dozen wealthy clients and salespeople. The officers forcefully escorted her out of the office and dragged her across the showroom floor, her furious shrieks echoing off the glass walls as they shoved her into the back of a waiting patrol car. I secured my wife's Mustang and arranged for a private transport to carry it back to my heavily fortified estate. Later that evening, my legal counsel informed me that Devin had desperately liquidated his last remaining hidden assets to post Megan's exorbitant bail just hours after her humiliating arrest. Their public humiliation instantly mutated into a frantic, furious retaliation. Knowing they had lost their quick cash grab and were running out of time with the syndicate, they aggressively accelerated their legal assault. Megan leveraged her shady legal connections to completely bypass standard judicial protocols. She successfully bribed a highly corrupt, sympathetic judge to sign an expedited emergency court order targeting my wealth. The next morning, as the sun barely peeked over the Atlanta skyline, my phone buzzed with an urgent alert from my property management team. Megan and Devin had expedited their corrupt court order, sending a team of highly aggressive, court-appointed commercial appraisers to forcibly enter my largest and most lucrative commercial building. The sun had barely broken over the Atlanta skyline when the heavy glass doors of my primary commercial plaza swung open with violent force. I was already waiting in the marble lobby holding a steaming cup of black coffee. Two men in cheap suits marched past the security desk, completely ignoring the sign and registry. They carried heavy leather briefcases and carried themselves with the unearned arrogance of men who believed they held absolute authority. The taller of the two men did not offer a greeting or an introduction. He aggressively shoved a folded legal document directly into my personal space, demanding immediate and unrestricted access to every single commercial unit in the building. He loudly declared that they were court-appointed appraisers operating under a preliminary emergency order signed by a superior court judge. According to his shouting, they were there to evaluate my total asset portfolio for an impending estate transfer mandated by my son and daughter-in-law. I recognized the name of the judge stamped at the bottom of the page. It was a notoriously corrupt official known for accepting political favors, someone Megan had clearly bribed to bypass standard judicial review. The appraiser sneered at me, tapping his clipboard against the marble reception desk. He told me that any attempt to delay their inspection would result in my immediate arrest for contempt of court. He explicitly stated that they had authorization to drill the locks on any tenant doors if I refused to hand over the master keys. They expected to find a terrified, confused old man intimidated by the sudden appearance of a legal mandate. They thought the official seal of a corrupt judge would force me to step aside and surrender my life's work. I did not flinch or reach for the master keys. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee and looked the lead appraiser dead in the eye. I let the suffocating silence stretch until his arrogant smirk began to falter under my unwavering gaze. I simply stood my ground, fully prepared to completely destroy their arrogant delusion. I stood firmly on the polished marble floor and looked around the vast, immaculate lobby. I remembered exactly what this property looked like in the early 1990s. It was nothing more than an abandoned, contaminated dirt lot situated in a heavily redlined district. As a young black civil engineer trying to establish an independent footprint in a ruthlessly segregated commercial market, I was systematically denied prime development loans by every major banking institution in the city. Diana and I had to leverage every single dollar we owned, emptying our savings and working grueling construction jobs just to secure the initial zoning permits. I personally poured the concrete foundation of this building. I spent countless nights sleeping in the unfinished corridors to protect our expensive copper wiring from local scavengers. Every steel beam and glass pane represented decades of absolute sacrifice, extreme financial discipline, and a total refusal to be marginalized by a system designed to keep men like me at the bottom. Devin and Megan believed they could simply waltz in with a bribed signature and casually steal my blood and sweat. Megan thought her white privilege and a fabricated court order would magically erase 40 years of my relentless grind. She assumed I was financially illiterate, a lucky retiree who had stumbled into wealth and kept it sitting in vulnerable personal accounts. She completely underestimated the intense paranoia and meticulous planning required to survive and thrive as a black business owner in America. Diana and I never left our hard-earned legacy exposed to random predators. We had built an impenetrable fortress around our assets long before Megan ever entered our son's life, anticipating the exact kind of treachery standing before me now. I placed my coffee cup down on the security desk with a quiet, solid thud. I reached inside my tailored suit jacket and withdrew a thick, professionally bound legal folio bearing the embossed seal of my corporate law firm. I handed it directly to the lead appraiser. He snatched it from my hand, annoyed by the delay, but as his eyes scanned the first page, his aggressive demeanor instantly evaporated. I calmly explained the lethal flaw in their expedited legal ambush. I told him that he was holding a certified original corporate charter. The document explicitly proved that the commercial plaza he was currently standing inside did not belong to William the individual. In fact, I did not personally own a single piece of commercial real estate in the entire state. This building, along with 12 other major properties, belonged entirely to an irrevocable corporate trust established over 30 years ago. I was merely the managing director of the holding company. I pointed a steady finger at the preliminary court order trembling in his hands. I explained with freezing clarity that the corrupt judge had signed an order targeting my personal assets for a family estate transfer. Because I did not personally own the building, his court order was legally worthless garbage. It held absolutely no jurisdiction over a sovereign corporate entity. I informed the appraisers that their presence in my lobby was no longer a court-mandated inspection. It was an unauthorized illegal commercial trespass. I gave them exactly 60 seconds to pack their briefcases and exit through the glass doors before I instructed my armed building security team to physically detain them for industrial espionage and corporate trespassing. The second appraiser turned completely pale, instantly realizing they had walked blindly into a massive legal liability. He grabbed his partner's arm, urging him to leave before they lost their professional licenses. The lead appraiser stared at the corporate charter, completely humiliated. He realized Megan had sent him into a federal trap without doing a single basic background check on the property titles. He aggressively shoved the useless court order back into his leather briefcase, his face burning with intense embarrassment. He knew proceeding any further would destroy his entire career. The lead appraiser was absolutely livid. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, dialing Megan's number and aggressively hitting the speakerphone button for the entire lobby to hear. Megan answered on the first ring, her voice dripping with arrogant anticipation, asking if they had secured the building. The appraiser screamed into the phone, cursing her for providing false legal directions and nearly getting him arrested for corporate trespassing. He told her the court order was useless against an irrevocable trust. Megan completely lost her temper. Her voice echoed through the marble lobby in a shrill, hysterical screech. She furiously demanded to know how my documents could overrule the paperwork she had forced her brother Trent to stamp at the hospital. She was so blinded by her own rage that she completely forgot she was on a public speakerphone. In a single moment of unhinged frustration, she had just loudly confessed the exact identity and location of her corrupt notary. I memorized the name Megan screamed through the speakerphone before the appraiser frantically ended the call. Trent Miller. The exact moment the defeated appraiser shuffled out of my lobby, I dialed Mr. Hayes. I gave him the name and instructed him to deploy his private investigators immediately. We did not have to wait long. Within an hour, Hayes called me back with a comprehensive background report that cracked the entire conspiracy wide open. Trent Miller was not just a random corrupt official Megan had found online. He was her estranged older brother. The connection was damning enough, but his current place of employment turned this from a simple forgery into a severe federal crime. Trent worked as a senior administrative clerk in the records department of the exact medical center where my wife spent the final weeks of her life. He held high-level security clearance, granting him unrestricted access to confidential patient files, legal intake forms, and personal belongings secured upon admission. Megan had not merely bribed a stranger. She had weaponized her own flesh and blood, utilizing his administrative access to bypass the hospital's strict security protocols. Hayes explained that Trent had a history of severe gambling debts and minor embezzlement charges that had been quietly swept under the rug by previous employers. He was the perfect desperate mark for Megan's scheme. She needed a notary stamp that carried the undeniable weight of an official institution, and Trent possessed the exact credentials required to make the forged will appear completely legitimate to a probate judge. I instructed Hayes to gather every shred of digital evidence connecting Trent to Diana's specific hospital wing during the dates of her admission. We were not going to invite him to a polite meeting. We were going to hunt him down and corner him with a mountain of undeniable proof. I wanted his digital footprint completely mapped out before he even realized he was a target. We needed to strike fast, ensuring he had zero time to destroy evidence or warn Megan that her greatest vulnerability had just been thoroughly exposed. A sickening wave of realization washed over me as I drove toward the hospital district. I vividly remembered those agonizing final days sitting beside Diana's hospital bed. I had refused to leave her side, holding her frail hand as the monitors hummed their steady, relentless rhythm. During those hours of profound grief, my focus was entirely on my dying wife. I was completely blind to the administrative machinery operating just outside her door. Megan had used my absolute vulnerability as a tactical distraction. While I was shedding tears over the woman I had loved for 4 decades, Megan was coordinating with her brother down the hall. Trent used his security badge to access Diana's secure intake file. He meticulously copied her authentic signature from her original admission paperwork, transferring the exact strokes onto the fabricated surrogacy agreement and the fake will. They printed the fraudulent documents on official hospital letterhead to guarantee their authenticity in a courtroom. The sheer depravity of violating a dying woman's room to steal her legacy required a level of sociopathic entitlement I could barely comprehend. Megan had transformed a sacred, tragic goodbye into a calculated heist. She looked me in the eyes, offered her fake condolences, and then walked down to the records department to seal my financial execution. The rage I felt was no longer hot or chaotic. It hardened into an absolute freezing determination to destroy them. She had effectively turned the hospital where my wife took her final breath into a crime scene. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, vowing that I would make her pay for defiling Diana's memory. Every signature they faked was another nail in the coffin I was building for them. Hayes and I tracked Trent to a greasy, dimly lit diner 2 blocks away from the hospital. He was sitting alone in a corner booth, nervously picking at a plate of cold fries. I slid into the vinyl booth directly across from him while Hayes took the seat by the aisle, effectively trapping him against the wall. Trent looked up, his eyes widening in sheer panic as he recognized me from the hospital corridors. Before he could speak, Hayes dropped a thick, heavy legal binder directly onto his plate. I watched Trent's hands begin to tremble as Hayes systematically flipped through the pages. The binder contained time-stamped digital access logs subpoenaed directly from the hospital's IT department. The data explicitly proved that Trent's unique employee identification badge had accessed Diana's restricted medical file 17 times during the exact week the forged will was supposedly drafted. The final page featured high-definition security camera stills showing Trent handing a sealed envelope to Megan in the hospital parking garage. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and spoke with a low, unwavering authority. I informed him that the documents in front of him constituted irrefutable proof of wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to defraud an estate. I laid out his options with brutal clarity. He could choose to remain loyal to a sister who would undoubtedly throw him under the bus the second the police arrived. That choice guaranteed him a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Alternatively, he could turn state's evidence immediately. He could sign a sworn affidavit detailing exactly how Megan orchestrated the forgery, provided the documents, and instructed him to use his official notary stamp. I promised him that if he delivered his sister to me on a silver platter, my legal team would advocate for his full immunity. Trent looked at the security photos, then at Hayes' stone-cold expression. He knew he was completely outmatched and out of time. The cowardice that allowed him to steal from a dying woman now compelled him to save his own skin. I stared into his terrified eyes and demanded his answer right then and there. I told him if I had to walk out of this diner without his signature, my next stop would be the district attorney's office to hand over everything. Trent grabbed a pen from his breast pocket with shaking fingers. He signed the sworn affidavit right there on the diner table, officially confessing to every single detail of the fraudulent notary scheme and naming Megan as the undisputed mastermind. Hayes secured the document in his briefcase, securing the ultimate weapon we needed to shatter their legal defense. While we were securing the confession, the anonymous package I had mailed earlier finally arrived at its destination. My sister Monica walked out to her porch and retrieved the unmarked envelope. She tore it open and stared at the highlighted financial report exposing Devon's massive $400,000 debt to the violent underground betting syndicate. The sheer terror of realizing she was being used as a disposable human shield completely broke her arrogant facade. Her intense paranoia pushed her to make a desperate, highly unpredictable move that would permanently alter the battlefield. I sat in the dim light of my living room when the frantic pounding began on my reinforced front door. The security cameras displayed my sister Monica standing on the porch, repeatedly hitting her bare fists against the heavy wood. She was entirely alone. The arrogant, triumphant posture she had paraded around at the birthday party was completely gone. She looked disheveled, terrified, and desperate. I unlatched the heavy deadbolts and pulled the door open just enough to let her stumble inside. She immediately collapsed onto the foyer rug, sobbing uncontrollably. The thick envelope I had mailed to her containing the forensic audit of Devon's massive gambling debts was clutched tightly in her shaking hands. She realized that the legal assault orchestrated by my daughter-in-law was rapidly stalling, and that the $400,000 syndicate debt was a highly lethal liability. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. Abandoning the entire facade of a grieving surrogate mother defending a rightful heir, she admitted that Megan was completely out of control and that the underground creditors were growing extremely violent. She grabbed the hem of my trousers, begging for an immediate private off-the-books settlement. She demanded exactly $200,000 in untraceable cash. In exchange for the payout, she promised to drop the lawsuit, pack up her infant son Leo, and completely disappear from the state forever. She was desperately trying to secure her own payout before the syndicate swallowed the entire fake inheritance. The sheer audacity of her proposal echoed through the quiet foyer. She was essentially offering to sell out her co-conspirators to save her own skin while simultaneously demanding a massive ransom to leave my life in peace. She rambled frantically about how she never actually wanted to hurt me, claiming Megan had manipulated her into presenting the forged will. She swore she only went along with the fraudulent surrogacy claim because Megan promised her a fast, quiet payout that would never actually require a drawn-out legal battle. Now that the scheme was exposed to dangerous criminals, her greed had been entirely replaced by raw, unadulterated fear. I stared down at my younger sister as she kneeled on my floor, wiping her running makeup with the back of her trembling hand. A profound, hollow sadness washed over me as I looked at the pathetic creature she had chosen to become. My mind drifted back to our grueling childhood growing up in a cramped, drafty apartment on the south side of the city. We had absolutely nothing back then. I remembered splitting single portions of cheap canned beans with her, ensuring she always ate the larger half so she would not go to bed hungry. I spent my teenage years working brutal manual labor shifts just to buy her a decent winter coat so she would not freeze walking to school. I had spent my entire adult life trying to protect her from the harsh realities of the world. Now she was kneeling in front of me, actively trying to extort the wealth I had built with my late wife. The profound tragedy of the situation was absolute. Monica had completely lost every last shred of her fundamental humanity. She was actively willing to weaponize her own innocent one-year-old infant, using her child as a literal extortion tool just to secure a quick financial payout. The baby was nothing more than a convenient prop in her fraudulent scheme, a bargaining chip to be traded for a bag of untraceable cash. The sister I had protected and fed during our most desperate years was dead, replaced entirely by a ruthless parasite who viewed family bonds as financial leverage. I realized that my constant willingness to bail her out of trouble over the decades had not saved her. My endless generosity had only enabled her worst instincts, ultimately teaching her that she could always demand a ransom for her own bad behavior. I stepped back, forcing her to release her grip on my clothing. I walked into the adjacent living room, retrieved my smartphone from my pocket, and deliberately opened the voice recording application. I activated the microphone, ensuring the bright red recording indicator was clearly visible, and placed the device face up in the exact center of the coffee table. I commanded Monica to stand up, walk into the room, and repeat her extortion demand directly into the active microphone. She froze in the hallway, her crying abruptly halting as the brutal reality of my defensive tactic registered in her panicked mind. I looked her dead in the eyes with absolute freezing clarity. I explicitly stated that I do not negotiate with financial terrorists under any circumstances. I told her that she was actively attempting to commit federal blackmail by holding a fabricated legal dispute over my head in exchange for a massive cash ransom. I informed her that the exact moment she chose to align herself with my treacherous daughter-in-law, she permanently forfeited any right to my protection, my sympathy, and my money. I formally and completely denied her request for a $200,000 settlement. I warned her that if she ever attempted to weaponize her child against my estate again, I would personally hand this audio recording over to Child Protective Services and ensure she spent the next decade rotting in a federal penitentiary for criminal extortion. Her face turned pale with sheer terror as she realized her ultimate leverage had just been entirely neutralized. I pointed a steady finger toward the open front door and ordered her off my property. I told her she was completely on her own to face the violent consequences of the criminal conspiracy she had eagerly joined. She tried to stammer a pathetic apology, claiming we were still blood relatives, but I immediately cut her off. I reminded her that blood means absolutely nothing when it is used as a weapon of deceit. I stood like a stone pillar in the foyer until her car engine finally started and her headlights vanished down the dark street. I calmly picked up my phone, saved the audio file to my secure cloud server, and locked the heavy deadbolts behind her. The trap I had meticulously set was now rapidly closing its jaws around the conspirators. Monica drove away from my estate, believing the worst thing she faced was a failed extortion attempt and a potential fraud charge. She was entirely wrong. Later that exact same night, the violent underground sports betting syndicate finally ran out of patience. They were completely exhausted by Devon's endless excuses and his desperate promises of a massive impending estate payout. The syndicate enforcers tracked the legal filings and realized that Monica was the primary claimant pushing the forged surrogacy will through the probate courts. Believing she currently held the key to the stolen inheritance money, two massive, heavily armed debt collectors pulled a black SUV into the quiet driveway of Monica's suburban home. The true nightmare she had blindly invited into her life was finally knocking on her front door. My phone lit up just past 2 in the morning with a frantic barrage of text messages, followed immediately by a massive video file. I tapped the screen and watched the black and white security footage from the front porch of my sister Monica's suburban home. A heavy armored black sport utility vehicle idled ominously at the curb with its headlights intentionally blinding the street-facing cameras. Two massive, broad-shouldered men wearing heavy leather jackets and dark ski masks stepped out into the quiet neighborhood. They did not attempt to hide their presence or act with any level of stealth. They walked with terrifying, deliberate purpose straight up her paved driveway. Each man pulled a solid metal baseball bat from their coats. In absolute violent synchronization, they began aggressively smashing every single window of Monica's parked luxury sedan. The brutal, rhythmic sound of shattering glass and crunching metal echoed loudly through the footage. They did not attempt to open the doors or steal a single item from the vehicle. This was a highly targeted message of pure physical intimidation. One of the massive enforcers casually walked up the front porch steps, pulled a heavy tactical hunting knife from his belt, and violently stabbed a thick folded piece of paper directly into the solid wood of her front door. The men calmly walked back to their vehicle and drove away into the night. My phone immediately rang. It was Monica. She was sobbing so hysterically I could barely understand her frantic words. She told me she had just pulled the terrifying note from her door with severely shaking hands. The underground syndicate had explicitly named the $400,000 deficit in bold black ink. They demanded the full cash payment by the end of the week, threatening to return and exact the debt in blood from her and her infant son Leo. She was trapped alone in her dark house, utterly paralyzed by sheer unadulterated terror. Through her terrified, hyperventilating sobs, the absolute reality of her situation finally broke through her lifelong delusion. She confessed to me that she had just ripped open the blank envelope I had mailed her days prior. She stared at the highlighted forensic audit exposing Devon's catastrophic gambling debts and the violent intercepted threats from his underground creditors. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in her mind. For her entire life, Monica had possessed an aggressive, unwarranted arrogance, fully believing she was smart enough to manipulate the people around her for fast financial gain. But looking at the shattered safety glass of her car and the violent ultimatum nailed to her door, she recognized with sickening clarity that she was the one being played. She finally understood the true meaning of the debt report. She was never going to receive a single dime of my fabricated inheritance. Megan and Devin had completely orchestrated the fake surrogacy claim to secure a massive cash payout to save their own lives. They desperately needed a disposable pawn to present the forged documents to the probate court, someone greedy enough to take the bait and stupid enough to put their own name on the official legal filings. They purposely positioned my sister as the primary financial claimant, so that when the violent debt collectors inevitably came looking for their money, they would target the woman publicly holding the inheritance. Monica realized she had eagerly volunteered to be a human shield for a ruthless daughter-in-law who viewed her as entirely expendable. Monica begged me to save her life. She frantically pleaded with me to hire a team of armed private security contractors to guard her property round the clock. She demanded I use my wealth to pay off the syndicate, immediately crying that I had to do it just to protect my infant nephew from being caught in a violent criminal crossfire. She aggressively tried to leverage our shared blood, screaming through the phone that it was my absolute moral duty as her older brother to shield her from the monsters standing at her door. I listened to her desperate, pathetic pleas while standing in the quiet, absolute safety of my own heavily fortified estate. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I maintained a perfectly stoic, unbroken composure. I spoke into the receiver with a voice as cold and hard as forged steel. I reminded her of the brazen extortion attempt she had tried to execute in my foyer just hours ago when she demanded $200,000 to disappear. I told her that she willingly stepped into the criminal underworld the exact second she agreed to help my son steal my legacy and defile my late wife's memory. I explicitly informed her that my physical protection, my financial resources, and my family loyalty were privileges she had permanently and irrevocably forfeited. I told her that when you eagerly invite starving wolves to a feast, you absolutely cannot complain when they look at the table and decide you are the main course. She screamed into the phone, crying out that I was sentencing her to death. I did not raise my voice or offer a single word of comfort. I simply advised her to pack a bag and run as far away as possible because I would not spend a single penny to bail her out of a lethal trap she had gleefully helped build. I severed the connection, permanently blocking her number from my device. I placed the phone face down on my desk, feeling completely resolute. I had spent my entire adult life providing a safety net for a sister who repaid me with absolute treachery. The safety net was officially gone. The very next morning, the structural integrity of their criminal alliance began to collapse entirely. Megan received a frantic, terrifying phone call from Monica, who was packing her bags to flee the state to avoid the syndicate enforcers. Megan instantly realized her disposable scapegoat was cracking under the extreme pressure. If Monica fled the jurisdiction or confessed to the police out of sheer terror, the entire forged will and the fake surrogacy narrative would instantly implode, leaving Megan and Devin to face the unmitigated wrath of their violent creditors entirely alone. Megan needed to legally secure the inheritance funds immediately before her co-conspirator vanished completely. Operating out of pure reckless desperation, Megan ordered her high-priced litigation firm to force a massive legal confrontation. Before noon, my attorney, Mr. Hayes, received an aggressive, urgent legal notice. Megan's lawyers had successfully filed a motion for an immediate expedited probate deposition, demanding we face them under oath the very next day. I stepped into the heavily air-conditioned conference room on the 40th floor of a downtown legal high-rise. The air inside the glass-walled space was freezing, deliberately kept at a low temperature by the opposing counsel to keep the participants uncomfortable and on edge. Mr. Hayes walked in right beside me, his posture radiating the absolute predatory calm of a man who held all the winning cards in a high-stakes game. Across the massive, polished mahogany table sat the architects of my attempted destruction. My sister Monica was pale and shivering, her eyes darting nervously around the room, clearly terrified by the violent syndicate threat she had brought upon herself just nights prior. My biological son Devin sat rigidly next to his wife Megan. Megan wore a sharply tailored designer suit she had undoubtedly purchased with a stolen credit card, her chin raised in a posture of supreme, unearned arrogance. Her high-priced lead attorney, a man with a ruthless reputation, sat at the head of their side of the table with a stack of heavily organized binders. The court reporter positioned herself at the end of the table, her fingers poised over the stenography machine. The exact moment she signaled that the official record was active, Megan's lawyer launched a relentless, highly aggressive verbal assault. He did not ask polite preliminary questions. He immediately accused me of being a bitter, controlling patriarch, actively attempting to hide my deceased wife's biological child out of pure malicious spite. He loudly declared for the record that my grief had mutated into a violent obsession, driving me to steal a multi-million-dollar inheritance from an innocent infant just to punish my family. He demanded I confess to manipulating the estate to exclude the rightful genetically proven heir. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, letting his theatrical accusations bounce off me like rain against a steel roof. I did not raise my voice in defense or show a single ounce of intimidation. I completely ignored the aggressive posturing of Megan's attorney and focused my attention entirely on the man sitting next to her. I locked my eyes directly onto Devin across the wide expanse of the mahogany table. I maintained an absolute unflinching stare, piercing right through his expensive suit and his carefully styled hair. I remembered a specific afternoon over 20 years ago when I took him to the construction site of my very first commercial plaza. I handed him a heavy steel wrench and told him that a man's legacy is built on the unbreakable strength of his given word and the quiet dignity of his daily labor. He had looked up at me with such profound admiration back then, promising me he would always protect our family name. Sitting in that freezing conference room, I silently mourned the total and permanent death of my son's honor. I watched the boy I had raised completely dissolve into a spineless, terrified shell of a man. Devin could not withstand the heavy weight of my gaze for more than 3 seconds. He physically flinched, his shoulders slumping as he stared intently at the polished wood grain of the table, utterly incapable of meeting his father's eyes. He knew exactly what he had done. He knew he had sold his soul to a violent underground betting syndicate and allowed his wife to desecrate his mother's memory just to save his own skin. He was drowning in his own cowardice, waiting for the legal machinery to magically bail him out of a lethal mess he created. He knew he had traded his birthright for a temporary delay in his own violent reckoning. He was no longer a son, merely a liability. Mr. Hayes placed a steady hand on my forearm, a silent signal that it was our turn to steer the momentum of the deposition. When it was my turn to speak, I answered every single hostile question with concise, stoic precision. I provided zero emotional reactions for their legal team to twist into evidence of psychological instability. I simply stated my name, confirmed the date of my wife's passing, and calmly denied any knowledge of a secret surrogacy arrangement. My flat, unyielding denials infuriated Megan. She could not stand the fact that I was not reacting to her highly orchestrated legal theater. Unable to control her arrogant need to dominate the room, she aggressively interrupted her own attorney. She leaned over the table, glaring at me with absolute contempt, and loudly volunteered to provide a sworn statement for the official court record. She confidently testified that she had personally been present in the hospital room during Diana's final days. She stated under the strict penalty of perjury that she watched Diana physically sign the surrogacy agreement and the updated will with her own hand. She brazenly claimed that Diana had cried tears of joy, begging Megan to ensure the baby received half the estate so Monica could raise him in comfort and financial security. Megan's attorney looked slightly annoyed by her sudden outburst, but he allowed it to continue. Believing her emotional testimony strengthened their narrative of a loving wife, subverting a tyrannical husband. I kept my face entirely blank, but internally, a massive wave of dark satisfaction washed over my mind. I deliberately remained silent, allowing her to speak uninterrupted as the court reporter rapidly typed every single word into the binding federal transcript. Megan was proudly and permanently sealing her own fate. She had just sworn under oath that she witnessed a dying woman sign a document that we already knew was a complete, verifiable forgery created by her own brother. The trap I had meticulously built over the past several weeks had just snapped violently shut around her ankles, and she was entirely too arrogant to feel the steel teeth biting into her flesh. She had handed us the ultimate legal weapon. With a highly theatrical and triumphant smirk, Megan settled back into her leather chair, firmly believing she had just delivered the ultimate irrefutable checkmate against my defense. Her attorney eagerly picked up on her aggressive momentum. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, securely sealed manila folder bearing the official crest of the state medical board. He slammed the heavy file down onto the center of the mahogany table with a loud, resounding thud that made my sister Monica physically jump in her seat. He loudly declared for the official record that they had successfully subpoenaed Diana's complete, unredacted medical history directly from the hospital archives. He pointed a steady, accusatory finger at my chest, aggressively demanding I immediately admit the absolute truth of the embryo transfer before he broke the seal and exposed my malicious lies to the court. The heavy paper seal on the manila envelope snapped with a sharp, crisp sound that echoed across the freezing conference room. Megan sat back with a victorious posture, crossing her arms and smiling at me as if she had already won the war. Her high-priced attorney pulled a thick stack of pale blue hospital records from the envelope, adjusting his reading glasses with immense self-satisfaction. He loudly announced to the court reporter that he was now entering Diana's authentic, unredacted medical history into the official probate record. He held the primary surgical summary up to the light, fully expecting to read a detailed account of a covert embryo extraction or a clandestine fertility treatment that would validate their entire inheritance claim. He cleared his throat and began reading the opening lines of the physician's notes aloud, dictating the dates of my wife's hospital admission with profound arrogance. He reached the center of the first page, his finger tracing the lines of the heavily typed medical terminology. Suddenly his voice completely halted. The arrogant cadence of his speech vanished, replaced by a suffocating dead silence. He read the sentence again in his head, his eyes widening in pure shock. I sat perfectly still across the mahogany table and watched the color drain entirely from his face. His skin turned a sickening pale shade of ash as the absolute reality of the document registered in his mind. He lowered the paper slowly, his hands beginning to tremble so violently that the pages rustled against each other. He looked at Megan, who was still smiling, oblivious to the nuclear bomb that had just detonated in her lawyer's hands. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked back down at the medical diagnosis, his mouth slightly open, utterly paralyzed by the lethal piece of evidence he had just willingly subpoenaed and entered into a federal record. I watched the ruthless litigation attorney realize that his entire career was effectively over. He had just aggressively championed a massive legal fraud built on a biological absolute impossibility. Looking at his terrified face, my mind drifted away from the freezing conference room and traveled back 45 years to a sterile, brightly lit hospital room in downtown Atlanta. I was just 25 years old, holding my young wife's frail hand as she woke up from a grueling 8-hour operation. Diana was only 22 when the doctors discovered the highly aggressive cervical cancer ravaging her body. The oncologist gave us a brutal, non-negotiable ultimatum. She could undergo a radical total hysterectomy immediately to save her life, or the cancer would kill her within 6 months. We never had a choice. I held her as she cried, mourning the biological children we would never get to raise together. But I thanked God every single day that my beautiful wife survived the ordeal. Diana's uterus and ovaries were completely and permanently removed before she even reached her 23rd birthday. She never produced a single viable egg in her entire adult life. Megan and Devin had built their entire criminal empire, their fake surrogacy claim, and their forged DNA test on a medical procedure that was physically fundamentally impossible. They had spent thousands of dollars buying fake wills and bribing a corrupt notary, completely blind to the agonizing medical tragedy that defined the early years of my marriage. They believed they were crafting an unbreakable legal narrative, failing entirely to do the most basic background check on the woman whose legacy they were attempting to steal. The suffocating silence in the room was finally broken by my voice. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the polished mahogany table, and locked my gaze directly onto Megan's trembling attorney. I turned my head slightly toward the court reporter, ensuring she was ready to type my exact words with absolute accuracy. I explicitly instructed the reporter to log a formal statement into the binding federal transcript right at this very second. I stated clearly and methodically that the sealed medical file currently sitting on the table proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my late wife Diana underwent a radical total hysterectomy 45 years ago. I detailed for the official record that she was biologically incapable of carrying a child, producing an egg, or participating in any form of embryo extraction during any point in her adult life. I watched Megan's victorious smirk instantly shatter, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror as she finally grasped the lethal nature of her mistake. I did not raise my voice, but every word I spoke hit the room like a physical strike. I pointed my finger directly at the fraudulent documents they had proudly laid out on the table just an hour prior. I informed the opposing counsel that the will they submitted was a total fabrication. I stated that the DNA test they purchased was a blatant forgery. I then reminded everyone in the room that just 10 minutes prior to breaking that seal, Megan had aggressively sworn under oath that she personally witnessed Diana sign that exact surrogacy agreement. She had willingly committed undeniable, massive federal perjury on an official court record. I laid out the charges with brutal, freezing precision. They had conspired to defraud a multi-million-dollar estate, committed identity theft, engaged in elder abuse, and executed a highly coordinated extortion plot based on a biologically impossible lie. I looked at Megan, whose face was now completely devoid of color, and told her that the trap she designed for me was the exact cage she would spend the next decade rotting inside. I had let them bring the gasoline, strike the match, and lock the door from the inside. Megan's attorney dropped the medical file onto the table as if the paper itself were burning his skin. He shoved his chair backward, desperately trying to distance himself from the toxic documents he had just proudly introduced to the court. Beside him, my sister Monica stared at the scattered medical records with wide, horrified eyes. The reality of her impending doom finally severed her last shred of sanity. She realized Megan had dragged her into a highly illegal, easily disprovable lie that guaranteed federal prison time and immense syndicate retaliation. A guttural scream erupted from Monica's throat. She lunged violently across the mahogany table, knocking over heavy glasses of water and scattering the fraudulent files everywhere. She physically attacked Megan, wrapping her hands around my daughter-in-law's throat, screaming hysterically that Megan had completely destroyed her life. Monica cleared the massive mahogany table in a single furious leap. Her hands collided directly with Megan's face before anyone in the freezing conference room could even register the sudden movement. Megan shrieked as Monica's fingernails dragged across her cheek, leaving deep red scratches. The heavy leather chairs crashed backward onto the carpet as the two women tumbled to the floor in a violently thrashing tangle of limbs and designer fabric. Monica was screaming hysterically that Megan had completely destroyed her life by dragging her into a biologically impossible lie. She rained frantic slaps down on her co-conspirator, entirely fueled by the sheer terror of impending federal prison time and the violent syndicate debt collectors she now believed were actively hunting her. Devin finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He rushed around the edge of the table, grabbing Monica by the shoulders, desperately trying to pull his aunt away from his wife. Monica spun around with unhinged adrenaline and shoved Devin squarely in the chest with both hands. His polished leather shoes slipped on the scattered medical files and he slammed hard against the glass wall of the conference room. The sickening thud of his skull hitting the reinforced pane echoed over the screaming women. While the family tore each other apart on the floor, the legal professionals in the room launched into a frantic, entirely self-preserving scramble. Megan's high-priced litigation attorney and his junior associates scrambled to gather their scattered documents. They shoved papers into their heavy leather briefcases with trembling hands, their faces pale with absolute panic. They had just unwittingly presented an explicitly forged will and completely fabricated medical claims to an official federal court reporter. They recognized immediately that remaining in this room for even 1 minute longer meant being actively implicated in massive federal perjury. They were abandoning their clients without a single shred of hesitation, solely focused on fleeing the scene to protect their own legal licenses from the explosive fallout of this undeniable conspiracy. I remained seated at my side of the table, utterly motionless. I did not raise my voice, and I did not lift a single finger to separate the violent brawl unfolding just a few feet away from my chair. I simply watched the greedy predators absolutely decimate each other. I folded my hands calmly over my stomach, breathing in the freezing conditioned air of the room. This was the exact undeniable outcome I had patiently orchestrated from the very moment Monica interrupted my wife's funeral reception with her forged documents. I remembered how my late wife Diana used to handle termite infestations at our early commercial properties. She always told me that you never go inside the walls swinging a hammer. You simply expose the nest to the bright daylight and let the insects consume themselves in their frantic panic to escape the heat. I had effectively stripped away the dark shadows of their deception by allowing the absolute medical truth to shine through. My son, my sister, and my daughter-in-law had built a flimsy criminal alliance based entirely on mutual greed and the arrogant assumption that I was a weak, grieving old man. The moment the foundation of their lie was exposed as a biological impossibility, their fragile loyalty instantly evaporated into pure violent self-preservation. I felt a profound sense of closure washing over my mind as I watched them burn their own bridges. They were doing the heavy lifting for me, destroying their own lives and reputations with every scream and every frantic shove. They had invited destruction into my home, and I was simply allowing it to run its natural course without any interference. Mr. Hayes sat completely unbothered beside me, as Megan's lead attorney snapped the clasps of his briefcase shut and turned to sprint toward the conference room door. Hayes reached into his own pristine portfolio. He pulled out a thick, securely bound folder and slid it firmly across the polished mahogany wood. The folder collided precisely with the opposing lawyer's hand, forcing him to pause his frantic retreat. Hayes instructed the man to open the file before he took another step, guaranteeing that what was inside would save him from disbarment if he acted immediately. The attorney hesitated, glancing nervously at the two women still screaming at each other on the floor before tearing the folder open. His eyes darted rapidly across the top document. It was the sworn notarized affidavit from Trent Miller, Megan's estranged brother. The administrative clerk had explicitly detailed the entire timeline of the hospital forgery, confessing exactly how Megan had ordered him to use his official security clearance to access Diana's restricted medical files. The affidavit explicitly named Megan as the absolute mastermind who provided the fake surrogacy agreement and demanded the fraudulent notary stamp. The lawyer read the confession, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as he realized the sheer magnitude of the criminal conspiracy his client had dragged him into. He looked down at Megan, who was now shoving Monica away and trying to climb back to her feet with blood on her cheek. The lawyer did not ask her for an explanation. He did not offer a single word of counsel or comfort. He turned directly to the court reporter who had remained frozen in her chair and instructed her to place his next statement on the permanent federal record. He formally and immediately withdrew as legal counsel for Megan and Devin, citing severe and intentional client deception. He loudly declared that he had been fraudulently induced to present forged materials to the court and was formally washing his hands of their entire defense. Megan froze, her eyes widening in sheer panic as she realized her expensive, aggressive legal shield had just completely evaporated. She begged him to stay, shouting that she would double his retainer right then and there. The attorney did not even look at her. He pushed through the heavy glass doors of the conference room and practically ran down the hallway toward the elevators, leaving his former clients entirely exposed to the devastating legal consequences of their actions. Devin pushed himself off the glass wall, rubbing the back of his bruised head. He looked at the abandoned chairs, the scattered damning medical files, and his wife, who was now entirely devoid of legal representation. The absolute reality of his situation crashed down on him with paralyzing force. He realized that the fake inheritance money was permanently gone. The violent underground betting syndicate would be hunting him by nightfall to collect their $400,000, and the federal authorities would be issuing arrest warrants for severe estate fraud by morning. He faced an immediate future consisting exclusively of a concrete prison cell or a shallow grave. Devin did not try to help his wife or apologize to me. He simply turned around and sprinted out of the conference room. He raced through the corporate lobby, jumped into his vehicle, and sped recklessly toward the international airport, desperately hoping to escape the country before the authorities could close the net. I did not chase my son through the corporate lobby. I sat calmly in my leather chair as the panicked lawyers cleared out of the conference room, reaching into my suit pocket to retrieve my smartphone. Years ago, when Devin first started managing some of my smaller construction sites, I insisted he use a secure corporate phone. I personally configured the device, embedding a military-grade location tracking application deep within the operating system to ensure the safety of my employees across remote job sites. He had completely forgotten about the software, or perhaps his arrogant wife had convinced him he was too smart to be monitored. I opened the application and watched a pulsing blue dot speed erratically down the interstate, heading straight for Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Devin was in full-blown panic mode. I knew his passport was practically useless given the impending federal warrants, but desperation makes men foolish. He was going to attempt to bypass standard digital booking systems, hoping to use whatever remaining cash he had stashed away to purchase a one-way ticket at a physical counter. He needed a flight to a non-extradition country somewhere the long arm of the United States probate and fraud courts could not easily reach him. I watched his digital marker merge onto the airport exit ramp, moving at reckless speeds that betrayed his sheer terror. The violent underground betting syndicate was undoubtedly already tracking the public failure of his fraudulent surrogacy case. They would be hunting him by nightfall to collect their $400,000 in blood. He was effectively trapped between a concrete prison cell and a shallow, unmarked grave. I stood up from the mahogany table, adjusted my tie, and walked out of this glass-walled room. I took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage, formulating my final move. I was not going to let a mob enforcer execute my biological son in an airport parking lot, but I was also not going to let him escape the severe legal consequences of his own treachery. I merged my faded pickup truck onto the crowded highway, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead while my mind waded through a profound, suffocating sorrow. As I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic toward the international terminal, I was forced to confront my ultimate failure as a father. I had spent my entire adult life building a massive commercial real estate empire, dedicating every waking hour to ensuring my family would never experience the brutal poverty that defined my own youth. I gave Devin every conceivable financial advantage. I paid for elite private schools, covered his university tuition in full, and handed him lucrative management positions within my company to secure his future. But sitting behind the wheel of my truck, the harsh reality finally broke me. I successfully provided him with immense generational wealth, but I completely failed to instill a single ounce of genuine moral character. I taught him how to read a balance sheet, but I neglected to teach him how to stand firm in the face of temptation. When Megan entered his life and demanded he trade his family loyalty for rapid, unsustainable luxury, he folded immediately. He chose the hollow prestige of a country club membership over the solid, unyielding love of his own parents. I realized then that a father cannot buy integrity for his son. You can build a financial fortress around your child, but you cannot force them to lock the doors against their own greed. I could no longer protect him from the world, and more importantly, I could no longer protect him from himself. I had to let him fall. Saving him now would only validate his horrific betrayal and disrespect Diana's memory. He was determined to destroy his own life, and I finally accepted that I could not save a man who actively chose the fire. I pulled into the airport's hourly parking deck and immediately dialed a direct number I had kept saved for emergencies. I called Sergeant O'Connell, a trusted veteran officer at the local precinct who had previously assisted my corporate security team with high-level trespassing issues. I rapidly briefed him on the situation, providing Devon's exact GPS coordinates, his physical description, and the federal fraud and perjury charges currently radiating from the downtown deposition. O'Connell did not waste a single second. He immediately dispatched a rapid response unit already stationed at the international terminal, coordinating with airport security to flag Devon's identity at all outbound checkpoints. I walked briskly through the sliding glass doors of the departure hall, weaving through the dense crowds of travelers with a heavy heart. My tracking application indicated Devon was cornered near a specific international ticketing counter. I stayed far back, blending into the periphery, near a row of automated kiosks, maintaining a clear line of sight without exposing my presence. I spotted him pacing frantically near the counter, sweating through his expensive tailored suit, desperately arguing with a ticketing agent while waving a thick stack of $100 bills. He was trying to bribe his way onto a departing flight to a small South American country. He never even saw the tactical officers approaching from his blind spot. 4 heavily armed airport police officers quickly surrounded him, completely cutting off his escape routes. The lead officer grabbed Devon by the shoulder, spinning him around with authoritative force. Devon's briefcase dropped to the polished floor, sending his cash and forged documents spilling across the terminal. The officers slammed him hard against the nearest concrete pillar, forcefully pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the bustling terminal sounded like a final definitive period at the end of our family history. I stood motionless in the distance, watching my only biological son sobbing and begging the officers for a second chance as they read him his Miranda rights. I did not step forward to comfort him or offer to pay for his legal defense. I simply turned my back on the pathetic scene and walked out of the airport, leaving him to face the absolute consequences of his actions entirely alone. While I was securing my son's arrest at the airport, Megan was executing her own desperate escape plan across town. She had managed to slip out of the chaotic deposition room while the lawyers were distracted, sprinting to her vehicle to flee the legal fallout. She drove erratically back to her luxury high-rise apartment, intending to pack a single bag of expensive jewelry and untraceable cash before disappearing completely. She shoved her key into the lock of her penthouse door, her mind racing with frantic strategies to avoid federal prison. But the exact moment she pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into her pristine foyer, her blood ran completely cold. The lights in her living room were off, but the shadows were occupied. Sitting calmly on her expensive white leather sofa were 2 massive, broad-shouldered men wearing heavy jackets. The violent underground betting syndicate had not waited for Devon to transfer the fake inheritance. They had come directly to the source. Megan dropped her designer travel bag the exact second she saw the 2 massive men occupying her pristine white leather sofa. She turned to run back into the luxury corridor, but a third man materialized from her designer kitchen, slamming the heavy oak door shut and securely deadbolting the lock. The syndicate enforcers did not raise their voices or offer polite introductions. They operated with terrifying mechanical efficiency. One of the men shoved Megan hard into a dining chair, forcing her to sit while his partners systematically tore her luxurious world apart. They stripped her apartment of every single valuable asset she possessed. They ripped her authentic diamond necklaces and tennis bracelets straight from her velvet jewelry boxes, shoving the glittering stones into thick canvas bags. They unmounted her high-definition smart televisions from the walls and seized every piece of modern electronics they could find. They marched into her master bedroom closet and cleared out her extensive collection of imported Italian leather handbags, tossing thousands of dollars of European craftsmanship into heavy garbage sacks like cheap rags. Megan sobbed hysterically, watching her entire curated identity vanish into the hands of ruthless criminals. She begged them to stop crying out that Devon was supposed to bring them the inheritance money from the estate. The lead enforcer stepped right into her personal space, his imposing shadow completely engulfing her trembling frame. He coldly informed her that the pile of designer goods and electronics barely covered the interest on the massive deficit they owed. He explicitly told her that the principal debt still stood at an unyielding $300,000. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a freezing absolute whisper, and promised her that the syndicate would return at the exact end of the week. He swore that if she and her husband did not produce the remaining balance in untraceable cash, they would happily collect the rest of the debt in blood. Megan sat completely paralyzed on her dining chair, surrounded by the hollow, ransacked shell of her once perfect penthouse. The absolute terror of the syndicate threat violently shattered the arrogant delusion she had cultivated for the past 5 years. She had spent her entire marriage looking down her nose at my faded jeans and calloused hands. She genuinely believed her pale skin and aggressive entitlement made her inherently superior to an aging black civil engineer who drove an ancient pickup truck. She thought she was the sophisticated mastermind playing a rigged game against a simple, uneducated widower. Sitting in the wreckage of her stolen lifestyle, the agonizing truth finally crushed her spirit. Every single ounce of power, prestige, and protection she thought she possessed was entirely dependent on the vast wealth I had meticulously built from the ground up. Diana and I had constructed the financial fortress that funded her country club memberships, her luxury vehicle lease, and her high society dinners. The exact moment I decided to pull the plug and withdraw my invisible safety net, her entire glamorous existence collapsed into violent, terrifying ruin. She was completely stripped of her arrogant privilege, left entirely exposed to the brutal consequences of the criminal underworld she had so foolishly invited into her life. She realized with sickening clarity that she was absolutely nothing without the money of the black man she had so viciously tried to destroy. Her manufactured superiority was a fragile, pathetic illusion, and the harsh reality of her own making was about to swallow her whole without any mercy. She understood that her cunning legal strategies and forged medical documents were entirely useless against men carrying baseball bats and hunting knives. The walls of her pristine sanctuary had fallen, leaving her to face a monster she could not manipulate with a fake smile or a corrupt notary stamp. Before Megan could even attempt to process the lethal ultimatum delivered by the enforcers, a series of deafening authoritative knocks hammered against her front door. The deep voice of a police officer commanded her to open the door immediately, announcing a formal execution of a search and arrest warrant. The three debt collectors reacted with lightning speed. They did not panic or rush blindly. They silently grabbed their canvas bags full of stolen luxury goods and slipped flawlessly out the rear service exit, disappearing down the emergency stairwell just seconds before the main door was breached. Armed officers swarmed into the penthouse, their heavy boots tracking dirt across Megan's pristine white carpets. The lead detective approached Megan, who was still trembling violently in her dining chair. He did not offer any sympathy for her ransacked apartment or her hysterical, gasping sobs. He firmly gripped her arm, pulled her to her feet, and forced her hands behind her back. The cold steel handcuffs clicked aggressively around her wrists, locking her into the inescapable reality of her federal crimes. The detective loudly read the official charges, echoing through the empty living room. She was being formally arrested for massive identity theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, federal perjury, and severe elder abuse. She shrieked wildly, kicking her bare feet against the floorboards as the officers dragged her toward the exit. The absolute pinnacle of her humiliation arrived the exact moment they marched her out of the apartment complex. The heavy glass lobby doors slid open, exposing Megan to the bright afternoon sun and a crowd of highly observant, wealthy neighbors. The residents she had spent years desperately trying to impress stood perfectly still, watching with wide eyes and hushed whispers as the self-proclaimed queen of the building was shoved into the back of a marked police cruiser. Her carefully curated image was completely incinerated in front of the local elite. She wept openly against the plexiglass divider, her reputation permanently destroyed by the sheer magnitude of her own unrestrained greed. The neighbors pulled out their smartphones, recording the undeniable downfall of the woman who had always treated them with thinly veiled contempt. The flashing lights of the police cruiser illuminated her tear-stained face as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, carrying her away from the luxury she would never experience again. I sat in the absolute quiet safety of my fortified study, watching the sunset paint the Atlanta skyline in deep shades of crimson and gold. My encrypted phone rested silently on the mahogany desk, a physical testament to the total collapse of the predators who had attempted to steal my legacy. The sudden harsh ringing of the device shattered the peaceful atmosphere of the room. I glanced at the glowing screen and saw an incoming call routed directly from the county correctional facility. I swiped to accept the connection, and the terrified, sobbing voice of my sister Monica filled the quiet space. She was calling from a highly monitored jail phone line, weeping hysterically into the receiver. She begged me to transfer $50,000 for her immediate bail, screaming that if she remained behind bars through the weekend, Child Protective Services would permanently seize custody of baby Leo. She frantically promised to drop every single fake claim against my estate if I would just rescue her from the terrifying consequences of her own actions one final time. The automated voice of the county correctional facility periodically interrupted her frantic, gasping sobs, reminding us both that every single word she spoke was being actively recorded by law enforcement. Monica ignored the automated warnings, launching into a desperate, high-pitched plea for salvation. She did not start with an apology for the forged will or the public defamation. Instead, she immediately weaponized our shared history. She tearfully recounted the freezing winters we survived as children in our drafty Southside apartment, begging me to remember the blood bond that kept us alive when we had nothing but each other. She painted herself as a completely innocent, terrified victim who had been aggressively manipulated by my ruthless daughter-in-law. According to her frantic narrative, Megan had preyed upon her financial vulnerability as a single mother, threatening to ruin her if she did not present the fraudulent documents at the birthday party. She screamed that she was terrified of the violent underground syndicate and absolutely petrified of the concrete cell block she was currently trapped inside. The entire performance was designed to trigger my deeply ingrained protective instincts. She demanded I wire $50,000 to a local bail bondsman, immediately swearing on our deceased mother's grave that she would pack her bags, take baby Leo, and vanish from the state the exact second she was released. She cried that the state authorities were already processing the paperwork to place her infant son into the foster care system. She explicitly tried to place the moral weight of her child's future squarely onto my shoulders, wailing that a good Christian man could never abandon his own nephew to a system known for destroying young black boys. She was using every ounce of psychological leverage she possessed, frantically pulling at the emotional strings she had successfully exploited for the past 4 decades. I sat in the dim light of my private study, listening to the shrill, echoing sound of my younger sister crying through the receiver. I did not interrupt her. I let her exhaust her rehearsed script, absorbing the sheer magnitude of her emotional manipulation. As her tears flowed over the secure line, my mind traced the exhausting 40-year pattern of our relationship. I remembered bailing her out of crushing credit card debt when she was in her late 20s. I remembered paying off predatory car loans in her 30s to prevent her vehicles from being immediately repossessed by aggressive collection agencies. I remembered silently covering her rent for months at a time whenever she quit a steady job out of sheer unwarranted arrogance. Every single time she created a massive crisis, she would invoke our shared childhood trauma, weaponizing the memory of our poverty to force my hand. I always stepped in to rescue her because I fundamentally believed that providing a financial safety net was my absolute uncompromising duty as her older brother. Sitting at my mahogany desk, the devastating reality finally settled deep into my bones. My relentless generosity had not saved my sister. It had completely destroyed her capability to function as a responsible, independent adult. By constantly shielding her from the natural consequences of her reckless choices, I had actively cultivated the entitled monster she ultimately became. I had taught her that she could commit any offense, burn any bridge, and betray any trust so long as she cried loudly enough to secure a payout. I was the silent architect of her arrogance, and this catastrophic extortion plot against my late wife's estate was the final lethal product of my lifelong enabling. The county jail's automated voice chimed in again, noting that exactly 1 minute remained on the scheduled call. Monica paused her hyperventilating sobs, waiting for me to offer the comforting reassurances and the financial bailout she had grown entirely accustomed to receiving. I took a slow, steady breath and spoke into the receiver with a voice as cold and dense as winter ice. I did not raise my tone or display a single ounce of residual anger. I spoke with absolute terrifying clarity. I informed my sister that I was permanently closing the Bank of William. I explicitly told her that I would not authorize a $50,000 wire transfer, nor would I contribute a single penny to her impending criminal defense fund. She gasped, the shock completely halting her tears as she realized her lifelong manipulation tactics were entirely failing. I systematically dismantled her victim narrative, reminding her that she eagerly stood on a chair in a crowded room and publicly defiled my late wife's medical trauma purely for personal financial gain. I told her that a true victim does not actively coordinate with a corrupt notary to steal a $1 million estate. She began to scream, her voice cracking as she loudly threatened that I was personally condemning baby Leo to a miserable life in the foster care system. I did not flinch at the venomous accusation. I responded with a brutal, unyielding truth. I told her that an innocent child was infinitely better off navigating the uncertainties of state care than being raised by a criminal extortionist who actively used him as a prop in a massive federal fraud conspiracy. I informed her that this was the final time she would ever hear my voice. I officially severed our blood tie, declaring that she was entirely on her own to face the devastating concrete reality of the federal justice system. I did not wait for her response or listen to her final panicked shrieks. I pressed the red button on my screen, disconnecting the call and permanently blocking the facility's outgoing number. I set the phone face down on the desk, feeling an immense, heavy burden lift entirely from my shoulders. The toxic cord was finally cut. The absolute collapse of their criminal alliance triggered a rapid, undeniable chain reaction within the justice system. Facing a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence, recorded confessions, and the devastating sworn affidavit from the hospital notary, the conspirators quickly realized that a drawn-out trial would result in maximum federal penalties. In a frantic, self-preserving scramble, Devin, Megan, and Monica all signed aggressive plea deals, desperate to avoid spending the rest of their natural lives in a federal penitentiary. The presiding judge entirely bypassed the standard lengthy docket, expediting their court dates to swiftly conclude the massive, highly publicized fraud case. The quiet, anticipated morning of the final criminal sentencing arrived under a heavy, overcast Atlanta sky. I put on my best tailored black suit, adjusting my cuffs with meticulous precision, fully prepared to witness the ultimate, undeniable legal judgment of the strangers who had once masqueraded as my family. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut behind me, sealing the massive room in absolute, suffocating silence. Every single wooden bench was packed to maximum capacity with local journalists, former business associates, and curious onlookers who had followed the massive public downfall of my family. I walked down the center aisle with a steady, unbroken stride and took my designated seat in the very front row. Across the room, sitting closely together at the polished defense tables, were the three architects of my attempted destruction. Devin, Megan, and Monica wore identical bright orange prison jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the hardwood floor every time they shifted their weight. The sheer contrast between their current captive reality and the arrogant, designer-clad predators they had been just months prior was absolutely staggering. Megan kept her eyes fixed firmly on the table, her face pale and drawn, completely stripped of her haughty white privilege and toxic entitlement. Devin looked like a hollow shell of a man, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, utterly destroyed by the violent syndicate debts and the crushing weight of his federal convictions. Monica simply wept quietly into her shackled hands, finally facing the devastating consequences of trading her brother for a fake inheritance. The lead federal prosecutor stood before the judge and meticulously laid out the entire timeline of their horrific conspiracy. He detailed exactly how Megan manipulated her brother to forge the hospital notary stamp while I was grieving beside my dying wife. He presented the fabricated surrogacy documents and exposed the sheer cruelty of weaponizing an innocent infant to steal a $1 million estate. He methodically explained their desperate, coordinated effort to strip me of my sanity, freeze my assets, and commit me to a locked psychiatric ward just to pay off an underground gambling syndicate. The prosecutor painted a flawless, undeniable picture of pure, unadulterated greed, ensuring every person in the gallery understood the lethal magnitude of their coordinated betrayal. I listened to the prosecutor dissect their crimes without letting a single emotion cross my face. I simply rested my right hand on the smooth, empty space on the wooden bench directly beside me. I could feel Diana's spiritual presence sitting right there with me, offering the same quiet, majestic strength she had radiated throughout our 45-year marriage. Looking at the empty space, my mind drifted back to the very first commercial property we ever purchased together. We had stood in the middle of a dilapidated dirt lot, holding hands under a blazing Georgia sun. Diana looked up at me that day and made me promise that we would build an impenetrable financial fortress, a legacy so strong that nobody could ever tear us down or push us back into the poverty we had barely escaped. I promised her I would protect our empire at all costs. I never imagined that keeping that sacred vow would eventually require me to stand in a federal courtroom and watch my only biological son be condemned to a concrete cell. The tragedy of the situation was immense, but I felt absolutely no regret. Diana had sacrificed her final waking hours to digitize and encrypt our entire history, suffering through physical agony to hand me the ultimate legal shield. I was merely wielding the weapon she had so brilliantly forged. I maintained my stoic posture, honoring her memory by refusing to show weakness in front of the people who had tried to defile her name. I knew that protecting her legacy meant I had to permanently sever the rotting branches of my own family tree. The presiding federal judge adjusted his glasses and looked down from his elevated bench, fixing his steely gaze on the three chained defendants. He did not offer a single word of sympathy or judicial leniency. He spoke with a booming, authoritative voice that commanded absolute respect from every corner of the packed room. He explicitly cited the sheer, unparalleled cruelty of their plot. He stated that weaponizing a grieving widower's trauma, fabricating a biological child out of thin air, and attempting to steal a man's freedom through fraudulent psychiatric evaluations represented the absolute worst of human nature. He told them they were not victims of circumstance or desperate financial hardship, but calculated predators who had methodically attempted to destroy a good man for rapid cash. The judge delivered the devastating verdicts with freezing precision. He looked directly at Megan, identifying her as the undisputed mastermind and primary architect of the massive identity theft and forgery ring. He sentenced my daughter-in-law to exactly 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He then turned to Devin, condemning him for his cowardly complicity, his massive wire fraud, and his active participation in the elder abuse conspiracy. He sentenced my biological son to 8 hard years behind bars. Finally, the judge addressed my sister Monica. He noted her pathetic attempt to extort me for $200,000 and her willingness to use her own infant son as a prop in a criminal enterprise. He sentenced her to 5 years in state custody. The exact moment the gavel slammed down against the wooden sounding block, the courtroom erupted into sheer chaos. Megan shrieked hysterically, thrashing against the heavy steel chains as 2 armed bailiffs grabbed her arms to drag her away. Devin collapsed forward onto the defense table, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of his ruined life finally crushed him. Monica screamed my name, begging for mercy as the guards forcefully escorted her toward the holding cells. I sat perfectly still and watched them disappear behind the heavy steel doors, their lives entirely ruined by their own relentless greed. I stood up from the wooden bench, adjusted my tailored suit jacket, and walked calmly down the center aisle. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the bright, bustling lobby of the federal courthouse. Mr. Hayes was already waiting for me near the towering marble columns, holding a pristine leather portfolio. He did not offer unnecessary congratulations or hollow sympathies. He simply unzipped the portfolio and handed me a thick stack of finalized, legally binding documents. It was the complete official documentation for the newly structured, irrevocable corporate trust. Every single asset, commercial property, and liquid account Diana and I had ever built was now permanently shielded behind an impenetrable legal wall. Mr. Hayes looked me in the eye and confirmed that my absolute legal invulnerability was officially cemented. No corrupt judge, greedy relative, or violent syndicate could ever breach my perimeter again. I took the documents, thanked him for his relentless service, and walked out into the crisp morning air, fully prepared to face the final chapter of my life on my own terms. The drive back from the federal courthouse felt entirely different than any journey I had taken over the past 6 months. The crushing weight of impending legal battles, the constant paranoia of home invasions, and the sickening reality of my biological son's ultimate betrayal had completely evaporated. I navigated my truck through the heavy iron gates of my estate, pulling up to the grand, imposing facade of the home I had built with my late wife. When I unlocked the heavy, reinforced front door and stepped into the foyer, a profound, sweeping silence greeted me. It was not the heavy, oppressive quiet of a tomb. It was the crisp, clean silence of a battlefield after the thick smoke has finally cleared and the enemy has been entirely vanquished. I walked through the immaculate living room, my heavy footsteps echoing against the polished hardwood floors. I faced the absolute, undeniable reality of my new existence. I was 70 years old, completely alone in a massive, sprawling house. My beloved Diana rested peacefully in the local cemetery. My biological son Devin, my greedy sister Monica, and my ruthless daughter-in-law Megan were locked inside concrete federal prison cells, permanently stripped of their freedom and their arrogant entitlement. I had permanently severed the rotting, diseased branches of my own family tree. To an uninformed outsider, my solitary existence might have looked like a tragic, hollow victory. They would assume the isolation was a terrible punishment. They could not possibly understand the profound relief washing over my entire spirit. The air inside my home was finally clean, entirely purged of the toxic greed and frantic manipulation that had violently poisoned my family for years. I took off my tailored suit jacket, draped it over a mahogany chair, and breathed deeply for the first time since Diana's funeral. I had survived the ultimate, agonizing betrayal of my own flesh and blood, and I had emerged from the fire with my wealth, my sanity, and my absolute dignity completely intact. I unlatched the newly installed heavy steel deadbolts on the rear patio door and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The shattered glass from Devin and Megan's frantic home invasion had been replaced with military-grade reinforced panes, rendering the house stronger and more secure than it had ever been. I walked slowly across the manicured lawn toward the back of the property, stopping beside a long, vibrant row of deep red rose bushes. Diana had planted these specific bushes with her own hands the very first week we moved onto this land. She spent hours kneeling in the Georgia dirt, carefully tending to the fragile roots. I reached out and gently pruned a dead, withering leaf from the nearest thick stem. I remembered a conversation we had decades ago when I asked her why she pruned the plant so aggressively. She looked at me with her bright, intelligent eyes and explained that you must ruthlessly cut away the dead, rotting wood if you want the healthy roots to survive and thrive. You cannot allow diseased branches to drain the vital life from the strong core. Her gardening philosophy perfectly mirrored the brutal necessary actions I had just taken in the federal courthouse. I looked at the flourishing red blooms and finally understood the absolute truth of my situation. A peaceful, quiet solitude is infinitely better than a crowded room full of venomous vipers waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I had forcefully removed the deadly parasites trying to consume our legacy, and the roots of my life were finally free to breathe. I returned inside and walked directly into my private study. Mr. Hayes had sent a secure courier to deliver a thick stack of final legally binding documents to my desk. These were not defensive legal motions or protective injunctions. This was the ultimate offensive manifestation of the vast wealth Diana and I had quietly accumulated over 40 years of relentless labor. I sat down in my heavy leather chair, picked up my favorite silver pen, and meticulously reviewed the charter for the newly established Diana Memorial Foundation. I was officially dedicating the overwhelming majority of my commercial real estate dividends and liquid corporate trust funds to a highly structured philanthropic mission. The foundation was explicitly designed to provide massive full-ride university scholarships for underprivileged Black and minority students pursuing rigorous degrees in civil engineering and architecture. I thought about Devin as I signed my name on the dotted line. I had handed my biological son the world on a silver platter, shielding him from the brutal realities of poverty, only to watch him squander his immense privilege to appease a racist, entitled wife and pay off an illegal sports betting syndicate. He violently traded his honorable birthright for the hollow validation of the local country club. I realized I could not change the catastrophic failures of his character, but I could absolutely redirect the powerful flow of my resources. Instead of allowing my fortune to be consumed by ungrateful, greedy relatives who viewed me as a disposable bank account, I was using my wealth to build up brilliant, hardworking young minds who actually understood the profound value of sacrifice. I was going to fund the ambitious dreams of kids who grew up in cramped apartments just like Monica and I did. Kids who possessed the moral integrity and relentless drive that my own son entirely lacked. I pressed my personal wax seal onto the final page of the charter, binding the foundation into absolute, irrevocable federal law. A triumphant, soaring sense of victory filled my chest. I had successfully weaponized my wealth against the predators who tried to destroy me, and now I was using that exact same wealth to build a permanent, beautiful monument to my wife's enduring memory. The golden hour approached, casting long, peaceful shadows across the manicured lawn. I walked back out onto the reinforced back porch holding a steaming cup of strong black coffee. I sat down in my favorite wooden rocking chair and watched the brilliant orange and purple hues of the sunset stretch across the Atlanta skyline. The frantic, exhausting noise of courtrooms, screaming relatives, and violent debt collectors belonged entirely to the distant past. The profound, beautiful silence of my home wrapped around me like a protective shield. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm, bitter liquid ground me in the present moment. I smiled, looking out over the vibrant rose bushes swaying gently in the evening breeze. My fortune was completely shielded. My beloved wife's legacy was permanently secured. The painful, necessary work was finally over, and the silent adjustment was entirely complete. Did you like my story? Let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to the channel if you believe that true family is built on genuine respect and not just shared blood. I look forward to reading your thoughts in the next video. The dust of the federal sentencing had barely settled when a new insidious problem arrived in my mailbox. It was a thick envelope bearing the distinct sterile stamp of the federal penitentiary where my biological son Devin was currently serving his 8-year sentence. I was not writing to offer a genuine apology for orchestrating the fraudulent surrogacy scheme. He was writing to demand a character reference for an expedited early parole hearing. His letter was a masterclass in the exact same manipulation his wife Megan had utilized for years. He blamed the underground betting syndicate for threatening his life. He blamed his Aunt Monica for fueling the legal fire. He blamed everyone except the man staring back at him in the mirror. He explicitly wrote that my refusal to write a letter of support would permanently destroy his chances of ever rebuilding a normal life. The conflict was no longer about money or physical safety. It was a direct psychological assault on my fundamental duty as a father. Sitting at the mahogany desk in my quiet study, I felt the familiar heavy weight of parental guilt attempt to claw its way back into my mind. I looked down at the signature on his letter and remembered a humid summer afternoon over 20 years ago. I had brought a teenage Devon to a massive commercial construction site, handing him a set of complex architectural blueprints. I explained to him that a skyscraper can possess the most beautiful, expensive glass facade in the entire city, but if the concrete foundation is poured over unstable soil, the entire structure will inevitably collapse under its own weight. I poured millions of dollars into Devon's foundation. I provided elite private education, debt-free university degrees, and high-level corporate positions. I supplied the finest materials, but I completely ignored the rotting soil of his character. My relentless financial protection had not shielded him from the world. It had merely insulated him from the natural consequences of his own arrogance. I realized the profound, agonizing lesson I had been forced to learn. Generational wealth is an absolute curse if it is not firmly anchored by generational wisdom. You cannot buy integrity, and you cannot shield a grown man from the fire he actively chooses to ignite. I did not tear the letter up or throw it in the trash. I pulled a sheet of heavy, customized corporate stationery from my drawer and uncapped my silver pen. I wrote a formal, meticulously detailed letter addressed directly to the Federal Parole Board. I did not request leniency or cite his previously clean criminal record. I explicitly outlined his active, willing participation in a conspiracy to strip a grieving widower of his sanity and his legal rights. I detailed how he stood silently in a freezing conference room while his wife committed federal perjury, perfectly willing to steal his deceased mother's legacy to pay off illegal gambling debts. I concluded the letter by stating that an early release would only validate his treacherous behavior and endanger the public. I folded the letter, placed a heavy wax seal on the envelope, and drove directly to the post office. I dropped it into the outgoing mail slot, feeling the final, lingering thread of my paternal obligation permanently snap. I had finally stopped trying to reinforce a collapsing bridge. Returning to my estate, I walked out to the rear patio and looked at the reinforced steel door I had installed after their violent break-in. The glass was immaculate, reflecting the bright setting sun. My life was no longer defined by the exhausting daily defense against domestic predators. I had successfully redirected my vast resources to the Diana Memorial Foundation, funding the brilliant, hungry minds of underprivileged engineering students who truly understood the brutal value of sacrifice. I had traded a toxic, greedy bloodline for a legacy built on genuine merit and unbreakable respect. The silence of my empty house was not a punishment. It was a hard-earned reward. I sat in my wooden rocking chair, drank my black coffee, and watched the evening shadows stretch across my vibrant rose garden. I had survived the ultimate betrayal, maintaining my absolute dignity without ever compromising my truth. Have you ever been forced to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace and sanity? Share your personal experiences and the hard lessons you learned in the comments section below. Your story might provide the exact strength someone else desperately needs to finally stand their ground against abuse today. Please remember to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story of resilience and reclaimed dignity. Thank you for watching, and always remember to protect your peace.